The first glimpse at any of the dungeons in Echoes of Wisdom occurs before we even take control of Zelda herself. During this prologue section, we briefly play as Link, though the amount of dungeon there is available to us, as well as the route you take through here, is both quite limited as well as heavily curated. We'll touch on the layout changes and how their paths deviate a little later in the video, but the point is that this makes sense as a tutorial section. We're taking control of Link at the end of his journey. It all feels so wonderfully familiar, and is a glimpse into the power we may be able to achieve again later on in the game. This little foray into Suthorn Ruins as Link is pretty brief, and there's not a lot of level design to analyze per se. There aren't any real forks in the road to navigate or puzzles to complete, but instead we're given some time to get acquainted with controlling our character in a relatively safe setting. Even though there are enemies known for being tough, like Darknuts, we're taking control of Link at such a powerful state that we're not really in harm's way at any time here. So while the navigation is simple, this is by design. A digestible, linear series of corridors and rooms containing little obstacles to get us familiar with the jumping controls, and a fair amount of enemies leading up towards the boss fight. An all too familiar boss fight against Ganon. Call it fan service, but I prefer to look at this as the game putting veteran fans squarely in our comfort zones before pulling the rug out from beneath us. Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda, an ongoing series examining all things dungeon related. With Link's Awakening's dungeons finished, we can dive into Echoes of Wisdom, which in many ways feels like a return to form after the way Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom deviated from the classic dungeon formula, but in just as many ways feels like a fresh, new interpretation of what a Zelda game can be. However, before we get into the first dungeon properly, there's a few pre-dungeon things to talk about. Let's hop right into things. Tutorials are something that always fascinates me. How does a game choose to teach the player its language and systems? The answer used to be a manual, but as time has gone on, game development has turned to more directly integrated forms of teaching. In the case of the Zelda series, this job fell on to the first dungeon. As the series has evolved, those tutorials gradually became more front-loaded, giving players more time before their first dungeon to learn how the game works. So the dungeon can be designed in such a way to apply those skills rather than teach them to you. Now, if you ask me which design philosophy I prefer, I really couldn't say at this point. I don't think either one is inherently better or worse, so long as the gameplay and that tutorial section are engaging to get through. It always comes down to execution. So what's interesting about all of this is that Echoes of Wisdom seems to straddle the line a bit. We had a Link tutorial section in the dungeon, albeit with a limited scope, and then we had all of that ripped away so that we could go through an additional tutorial outside of the dungeon as Zelda. And I think it's handled pretty well. It doesn't last long or overstay its welcome. Instead, it neatly sets up the story and sends you on your way. And I can say confidently, being on my third playthrough of the game now, that it succeeds in remaining engaging on repeated playthroughs. Say what you will about stealth sections, but I found enjoyment in trying to approach this scenario in different ways each time I ventured through here. Exploring the Suthorn Beach, village, and forest, meanwhile, is a more limited space, a microcosm of the overworld exploration, teaching you that if you poke look into nooks and crannies, you'll be rewarded, whether it be via cash, heart pieces, or useful echoes. At the end of the forest path is where we will find our portal into the still world, and by extension, our first dungeon. So, in the first hour or so, the game has taught us quite a lot, including how its overall structure will play out. Explore the world, talk to people for story stuff, find your way into the rifts, use the echoes you obtained in Hyrule to platform through the still world, and then tackle the dungeon. So, with all of that said, let's get to talking about the dungeon itself. Once we've made our way through the stilled southern forest, we can head into the dungeon. Welcome back to Suthorn Ruins, the first dungeon in Echoes of Wisdom. Suthorn Ruins is a simple dungeon. I doubt there will be anything here that stumps you or keeps you puzzling over what to do next. And while many people would take that as a statement of criticism, that is, in fact, the dungeon design working as intended. This is a tutorial dungeon. It's the first proper dungeon in the game. Starter dungeons should be simple, so long as they are not boring, which I don't think this is. It's all about laying the groundwork. But first, let's have a look at the architecture. It looks pretty good. The whole place just reeks of lost ancient ruins with stone bricks and signs of deterioration that go back farther than the recent collapse of the structure that we witnessed during the game's prologue. My only real critique might be that because it leans so heavily into that idea, it comes across as a little generic and without a strong visual identity of its own like later dungeons will have. As though if it were removed from its context within the game, it could be slotted in pretty much anywhere in Hyrule. It's the epitome of generic Zelda dungeon. However, I do think that was intentional to an extent, and we'll circle back to why that is in a little bit. Despite that lack of strong visual theming, Suthorn does have some nice memorable set pieces and visual landmarks that do help it stand out, such as the massive elevator, these moving platforms, and this long, dramatic staircase. So it's not without some cool moments. Moments that are there to tie our second venture into the dungeon with our initial trek through as Link. If the player hadn't yet connected the dots of this being the same place for some reason, then that elevator is going to be the thing that reaffirms that for them. Though when we come back as Zelda, we don't get to visit this hallway, which had some really nice lighting effects with the windows here, alas. There's also some cool little eye motifs on the walls all over the place, though strangely, rather than pupils, we see these little dots and dashes, almost like Morse code symbols, though they don't seem to actually translate to anything as far as I could tell. A different interpretation is that rather than eye shapes, these could be a repeating double helix pattern, which is naturally harder to depict on a flat surface, but that might fit better than eyes given that sometimes the orientation is vertical rather than horizontal. And the double helix pattern does somewhat call to mind the way the tri-rod splits and twists around itself in a way, but maybe I've just spent too long looking at these walls. Speaking of which, there's also this carving along various pillars, which too looks like it could be a depiction of the tri-rod or something similar. Between that and the various little dashes and dots, Suthorn Ruins could have been a temple with ties to the tries themselves. I mean, have a look at these stone tablets and the faces of Tri's friends. Maybe I'm reaching, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were some connection, the knowledge of which may have been lost to time, especially since this is the temple Tri was originally imprisoned in during the game's prologue. The dungeon music, like the architecture, errs a bit on the generic side. it's a little forgettable compared to some of the offerings of the rest of the game's soundtrack, but it's far from a bad dungeon theme, and listening to it on repeat while writing this script has actually made me appreciate it more. It fails to be the kind of dungeon theme that I'll be humming to myself, but it still does the job and fits the atmosphere pretty well to a T. The song strikes that delicate balance of mysterious and dangerous, which is very dungeon-esque, as these places tend to contain a healthy mix of combat and puzzles. Overall, the song is unintrusive, but at times feels thoughtful in a way. It may not be very catchy, but I'm also of the belief that not every dungeon theme has to be. I mean, the majority of both Wind Waker and Twilight Princess's dungeon themes are mostly atmospheric or ambient, so it may not be fantastic, but it does its job well enough. As for the navigation, things are pretty much as simple as you'd expect for a first dungeon. As I stated earlier, the game is establishing its difficulty curve pretty gracefully so far. Progression is straightforward, but rewards players who choose to deviate from the main path with treasure chests and rewards, teaching and reinforcing to us that exploration is worthwhile. Then that idea gets further reinforced a little later on, as these splits in the path get promoted from optional detours to critical parts of the dungeon progression, by way of incorporating locked doors and keys to find. These forks in the road often have one locked door and a key to find via the other path, though sometimes there are even additional deviations in these key paths. This is all done on a relatively small scale, but again, this is simply the starter dungeon. Something that I find to be pretty neat is the way the game uses in-universe means to differentiate our two journeys through the ruins. The path we take here originally as Link mostly keeps us sticking to these eastern and central hallways, as these deviations are blocked off by rubble, with Link's journey ultimately coming to a close in this arena where we battle Ganon. When we return as Zelda, many of the rooms we went through as Link are likewise inaccessible due to fallen debris, and there are even rooms sliced away entirely by the rifts, though in turn new paths have been exposed that Zelda can now take. So the overlap between rooms that these two end up exploring is pretty minimal in the end. Furthermore, the room that serves as Link's boss room ends up only being the mid-boss room when Zelda shows up, with a whole extra chunk of dungeon for her to continue on through afterwards. So in the end, while the more memorable moments will drive home that association, Zelda takes a distinctly different route through the dungeon than Link did, which, from a design standpoint, was the right call, as it keeps things from getting too repetitive. Rather than finding a traditional dungeon item in here, the game has a handful of stand-ins that essentially work the same way. Your first thought is probably the echoes that are available to learn here, and you wouldn't be wrong there. Strantulas act almost like a stand-in for using a hookshot or grappling hook to gain height or cross gaps, though some of the most useful echoes, such as the Peahat or the Ignizol, were found just before the dungeon, but there are workarounds if you missed those. That said, what feels to me like the big item stand-ins for this dungeon specifically are Bind and Sword Fighter form. Let's begin with the former. We gain access to Bind quite early on in the dungeon, and it has great utility all throughout. Initially, we're taught to use it to move this boulder so that we can access a switch and open a door. Then that gets a bit of a shakeup where a boulder is blocking a hidden passage, but we can also move it into position to use as a platform and cross this gap. Then we can use it to pluck this treasure chest out of the ground. I think the implied method is also to move this rock out of the way with it, but I'm sure there are other equally valid ways around it. From here on, the dungeon continues iterating on the uses for bind. There's a shield on this statue that acts as a mechanism for opening this door when you pull it, but is also a hint towards how you can use bind to yank shields out of enemy hands, including this dungeon's mid-boss. And since the dungeon keeps putting bindable things behind bars, you will probably also pick up on the fact that you can use bind on these Deku Babas to just pull their heads right off. My favorite though is this series of iterated upon puzzles, in which we use bind to manipulate statues and press down switches. These are particularly great and are used for lowering gates and then ultimately getting the boss key. I know a lot of people were quick to compare bind to Tears of the Kingdom's Ultra Hand, and while I can understand why, I mean just look at it, I feel it's a bit of a shallow comparison. Ultra Hand had very few limitations. You could freely move an object and yourself around, including rotating, manipulating, and attaching things. That's not the case with bind. Instead, it mechanically more closely resembles the Dominion Rod from Twilight Princess. Once you have bound to an object, you can only move it in tandem with your own movements, allowing the developers to craft puzzles which incorporate this ability into the room layouts. You can't just pick up a statue and place it onto the Switch. You have to move in such a way to make that feasible, even if it means building your own staircase ahead of time to pull it off. I like this mechanic a lot, and this dungeon's puzzles showcase its potential really nicely. There's also reverse bond, which flips it so that you are being moved by the bound target instead, which gets put to use in this dungeon with these moving platforms. But the versatility of reverse bond will only grow as your arsenal of echoes expands. The other item stand-in is Sword Fighter form, which we get after a mid-boss against an echo of Link. Sword Fighter form essentially lets you transform into Link for a short period of time, as indicated by this gauge, which will gradually deplete while you're using it. I have mixed feelings about its inclusion, if I'm being honest. There are times when the game really feels like it pushes for you to use it, especially during boss fights, but its usefulness constantly swings between being really overpowered and being superannuated by other abilities as the game goes on. It is a mixed bag, but it also is the key to a simple item gate, those being these dark web-like barriers that block various doorways through the dungeon. So from that standpoint, it is a key item that is critical to dungeon progression, as well as being a very useful tool for combat, albeit one with some limitations. Let's talk about that mid-boss too. Fighting Link here is a rare treat, and I feel they did him justice in this encounter. He will shred through pretty well any enemy echo that you summon. That little taste of being overpowered in the game's prologue, that was both to teach you the mechanics of Sword Fighter form, as well as being foreshadowing for this fight. He is relentless, so you've really got to strategize to take him down. But with all of the tools at your disposal, it is more than doable, especially if you picked up on that hint from the statue earlier about using bind to rip away his shield. All in all, it's a great mid-boss fight. So with all of that said and done, once we've made our way through here, collected these keys and completed these puzzles, we can use the big key to open this rather imposing door and confront the dungeon boss. Rising from the ground is the Seismic Talus, our first dungeon boss, and he looks great. Aesthetically, of course, he's a big rock golem with a glowing weak point orb, which will get shuffled around his body over the course of the battle. A real Thardus situation for my fellow Metroid fans, but its rocky appearance paired with the glowing purple is a great look for this boss, perfectly straddling that line of being imposing, but also fitting with the game's art direction. What's interesting to me is that Talus's are very Wilds era in terms of bosses, but I think they translated what was an open world boss into a traditional dungeon boss very well. Bind, being our stand-in for a dungeon item, gets put to particularly good use here. You don't have to use it to fight him, but it will make the fight much easier. You can use Bind to yank his weak point right out of him, which naturally will stun him and leave him vulnerable to attack, either through use of echoes or sword fighter form. That said, there's just enough versatility in this fight for you to approach it differently and still come out victorious, so long as you put in the work. He's got some pretty good sweeping attacks, which he telegraphs well, giving the fight an overall good push and pull sort of flow, pun intended, as you need to avoid getting caught up in his large swipes and punches in order to pull off the bind strategy with effective timing. As the fight goes on, his weak point will keep moving to higher up on his body as well, eventually going from his bottom to literally the top of his head, effectively narrowing the window of timing for you to use either bind or directly attack his weak point. In other words, the fight has its very own built-in difficulty curve, getting just a touch more challenging the further through the fight you get, which is rarely seen in a boss fight without them just outright having additional phases that either alter their behavior or expand their repertoire of attacks. This is a simple adjustment that does the same trick, and while the fight never gets to be too hard, we're still in the first dungeon, I can't help but admire how clever that little touch of design is. So, in the end, the Seismic Talus may at first glance be a rather unremarkable boss, but in actuality ends up being quite well designed, fulfilling its role as first boss gracefully. So overall, Suthorn Ruins is a solid starter dungeon. It introduces the player to key new mechanics, then iterates upon them. It has exciting set pieces that fit into and progress the story, and teaches us through its own layout how dungeon progression will go. I cannot describe how palpable my excitement was when I saw a locked door, okay? A few more notes I have though, so I'm sure that if you watched my coverage of Link's Awakening's dungeons, then you may have anticipated this talking point being included, but I don't think my conclusion on the subject will be as predictable. For context, when talking about that game, I stated multiple times that I was not a huge fan of these side-scrolling passageways, as I felt they were a cheap band-aid solution to bridge disconnected rooms. I felt it was a byproduct of the game so rigidly trying to maintain their dungeon's map layouts, as most of them were shaped after various objects. Bottle Grotto after empty bottles, Key Cavern is shaped like a key, you get the idea. In the remake, this issue was alleviated by the ability to leave pins on the map, so that you could see at a glance how the various rooms connect to each other. So I was a little nervous going into it with Echoes of Wisdom, knowing full well that these side-scrolling passageways would be returning, but I am happy to say that I don't feel the same way about it here. Rather than feeling like they've boxed themselves into a layout and needed an easy way to connect rooms without actually just connecting them, these sections in Echoes of Wisdom feel like they were intentionally included as parts of the level design from the start. The dungeons aren't really locked into shapes, and these passageways are fully displayed on the map with with connecting lines to show you how they integrate with the rest of the dungeon, and they're all greatly expanded upon. In Link's Awakening, they tended to be essentially short hallways, with the odd obstacle thrown in. Here, they can span multiple screens and usually have their own puzzles and mechanics built in. All in all, the concept just feels better fleshed out here, like they've more fully realized the potential of this. So rather than just needing to connect some rooms, they've made it a proper part of the dungeon. One that is, again, visible on the map by default. Thank you. Speaking of the dungeon map, we get those, although no compass. Still, I like its inclusion, as silly as that may sound. Tears of the Kingdom, for whatever reason, removed the need to obtain the map at all, giving it to you automatically as soon as you stepped into a dungeon. Even Breath of the Wild had you needing to download it from a terminal at least. While I don't feel quite as negatively about Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons as many people do, in fact, I even like most of them, I still felt like the absence of that requirement was a bit odd. But it's back in Echoes of Wisdom, and I'm here for that, because it means you have to actually explore to find it, which is a rewarding part of the overall dungeon experience for me, though they've done away with the compass and combined it with the map like Skyward Sword did, which is too bad because I like finding the compass too. Maybe it's because Link's Awakening made the compass just a little extra useful, but alas. That said, I do have a little bit of a gripe with how the map screen itself is handled. This is more of a UI complaint than one with the dungeon design itself, but still, hear me out. I just find the field of view on the map screen to be a little too tight. I like being able to zoom in on the map, but I'd also like to be able to zoom out more. I prefer being able to open the map and see the entire dungeon at a glance, or at least the entirety of the floor that I'm on. It gives me a better feel for the space and the overall bigger picture. Instead, we get this scrolling thing, and the passageways, while connected on the map, are separately placed on the bottom of the map screen. So while it's better than in Link's Awakening, they still feel a little more removed than I'd like. So this is a mock-up of how I would display it for readability's sake, but that's just me. All of that said, as I was playing through this dungeon and taking notes, one word kept jumping out to me. That word was generic. The dungeon feels generic. Its appearance, its music, enemies, even the branching path system of its layout. There's plenty of cleverness in there, and it is extremely effective at teaching the game to the player, but it otherwise felt weirdly lacking its own identity in a way that this game's other dungeons don't. But as I kept seeing that word pop up in my notes, and then seeing the way various elements of this dungeon bear aesthetic resemblances to Wild Era elements, while having mechanical similarities to classic Zelda elements, it all started to make sense in my head. So here's my theory about why this dungeon was made the way that it was. I believe this dungeon was designed to introduce classic dungeons to a new audience. While many of us series veterans might write this off as being too simple of a dungeon for our tastes, any Zelda game could be someone's entry point into the series, and that's a good thing. And so the game needs to have an establishing dungeon to make sure new players can learn the core systems and design ideas, especially after the huge influx of new fans that were brought in by the Wild Era games, who may have never laid eyes upon a boss key before. I know. In other words, I think this dungeon was specifically made to teach players who became Zelda fans from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom how classic Zelda dungeons work before the rest of the game runs with it and experiments. They give you an ability that looks familiar. It looks just like Ultra Hand, but it doesn't work that way. It works like the Dominion Rod. They give you the ability to construct your own platforms and bridges. You might think, hey, that's just like Tears of the Kingdom, but now you're in tight spaces and side-scrolling sections with severe limitations. They give you a boss literally right from Breath of the Wild, but you don't fight it that way. It's been redesigned to fit the parameters of this game. How clever is that? I don't say this to drive a wedge in the fandom. I am not trying to divide long-time and new fans. Quite the opposite. I think this game and this dungeon are really doing the opposite, uniting them. Old meet new. Before we continue on, I'd like to offer a quick tangent about dungeon order, since it's a question I've gotten a lot. After completing Suthorn Ruins and rescuing Minister Left, we're actually given pretty much free reign of exploration in Hyrule, and the choice between two dungeons to tackle next: the Gerudo Sanctum to the west and Jabul Ruins to the east. The choice of dungeon order will present itself again later on in the game, so just like with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I made sure to consider as many factors as I could to settle on a dungeon order for this video series. In the end though, the answer lies in two places. The first indicator is found in the game's files, which actually number the dungeons. Second is the game's playable boss rush, which orders the dungeon bosses according to that same numbering, regardless of the order you actually play them in, with the exception being it placing the Ganon fight at the very end. So for the sake of this video series, the order I will be tackling these dungeons in will follow that numbering. But when playing the game, you don't have to do it this way. In fact, I went to the Gerudo region first on my initial playthrough due to its proximity to the southern prairie, but I digress. That said, doing it in this order will provide a pretty elegant difficulty curve in most cases. With that out of the way, let's hop into the video. On the east side of Hyrule sits the usually calm Jabul Waters, home to the Zora tribe and the Zora tribe? The amphibious peoples of the River Clan and Sea Clan find themselves feuding, whilst unbeknown to them, their patron deity, Lord Jabu Jabu, has been replaced by a rampaging imposter. In order to mend both the rifts of the land and the growing rifts between these Zora leaders, we must enter into the still world once again and set things right. It is here, in the far reaches of the stilled Jabul waters, that we'll find the Jabul Ruins, Echoes of Wisdom's second or third dungeon. Previously, I described Suthorn Ruins as relatively simple, which fits the bill for the game's first dungeon. But compared to Jabul Ruins, Suthorn might as well be a lengthy labyrinth. Remember when water dungeons were complicated? And why is this dungeon shorter than the last one? But before we get too much into that, let's talk about some of the positives here. Firstly, this is a great looking dungeon. It's visually distinct and has strong theming, a notable improvement over Suthorn in that respect. There's a blend of natural stone and man-made structure, or Zora-made I suppose, with plenty of plant overgrowth. It actually bears quite a bit of aesthetic similarity to Angler's Tunnel from the Link's Awakening remake, a dungeon I similarly praised. The walls have fish-themed engravings, including some larger carvings of presumably Jabu himself. There's also a strong visual tie-in to how the dungeon objectives are completed, with this visually striking central room having a large fountain with color-coded water spouts, and connecting lines linking back to the various corners of the dungeon with corresponding color-coded switches that activate them, which somewhat reminds me of the pipes that snake around Great Bay Temple in Majora's Mask, or the lines on the walls of the revised Water Temple in Ocarina of Time 3D. Point is, the place all makes visual sense and is just pleasant on the eyes. The art team nailed it here. I particularly like these little flower lamps. Such a cute detail. The music is also pretty much perfect for a water dungeon. It frequently shifts between tranquil to these moodier and more dangerous sections. It's extremely fitting for a place that is presumably spiritual and serene for the Zora people, but is currently corrupted, having been ripped out of Hyrule and suspended in the void of the still world. That whole vibe is just captured perfectly here. There's a particular instrument used here that sounds like water dripping. It's such a great touch. Alright. But on to the actual navigation, which is just extremely simplistic. Its structure overall resembles that of a Wilds-era terminal-based dungeon, especially Breath of the Wild's DLC dungeon, The Final Trial, and to an extent, the Palace of the Four-Sword from the GBA release of A Link to the Past as well, but not done with nearly the same level of finesse or creativity as those ones. I know that as soon as I say terminal dungeon, there are going to be people who assume that automatically is what makes it bad. But while I felt it worth pointing out that similarity in structure, I'd also like to point out that this is not the reason I didn't enjoy it. A dungeon in this style can work if it has creative enough obstacles, puzzles, or challenges in it. Again, see the Palace of the Four-Sword, or more recently, the Lightning Temple of Tears of the Kingdom, which I quite enjoyed. Though I would be lying if I didn't admit that there is a certain style of Zelda dungeon that I tend to prefer, which are usually those with sprawling navigational challenges, the big tangled knot style dungeons. Jabul Ruins' segmented structure means that everything is separated into individual room challenges. Though there is an overarching objective to work towards, aside from those buttons and the main fountain in the central room, nothing in any one room really has an impact elsewhere. Nothing you find in one part of the dungeon will ease your progress through another part. But let's rewind a little. The first notable thing to happen in the dungeon is right here in the foyer. There is a section of floor that will immediately crumble, dropping you into an underwater section. It's here that a giant fish monster will unleash a little vortex attack, acting as a chase sequence. It doesn't last very long, but it is an exciting way to start the dungeon off. To be honest, I kind of have a soft spot for chase sequences like this. After that brief linear section at the start of the dungeon, you'll find the main central room, which, to its credit, is memorable and distinct. From here, there is a locked door and 4 pathways outward from the central room. These can be tackled in any order, and each one will activate one of these faucets, pouring water into the central chamber, which will in turn increase the height of the fountain's outpouring. In other words, more water equals more areas that you can reach. On paper, that sounds all well and good. A dungeon with a distinct central room, which the navigation all branches off from, having to explore every path to work towards a tangible and understandable goal. This should be great, if not for how utterly cheesable the whole thing is. In any other top-down Zelda game, the dungeon layout would be enough to prevent this, but Echoes of Wisdom has armed you with everything you need to break this dungeon into pieces, without having to go out of your way for any of it. Firstly, there is the Crawlchilla, which pretty well allows you to scale any wall without any restriction, meaning that the entire core gimmick of the dungeon, that being the need to raise the water level to gain height, quickly becomes meaningless. You also acquire the water block in the still world, which is an incredibly useful tool, but also trivializes most challenges related to gaining verticality or crossing gaps. Heck, if you know which part of the foyer floor collapses, you can entirely bypass that earlier chase sequence. And these are not echoes you have to go out of your way for to cheese the dungeon. The Crawlchilla is found in an area right by Luberry's house after Suthorn Ruins. It's almost a guarantee you'll encounter one of these enemies after the first dungeon. And the water block is found in the still world during this dungeon lead-up section. So, the entire dungeon ends up being pretty much undermined by the tools at your disposal. Had they shown some restraint, perhaps saved the water block for a little longer, perhaps even giving it to you as a useful mid-dungeon reward, maybe after a mid-boss that uses water attacks, like a dungeon item, then I don't think this would be nearly as much of an issue, though the Crawlchilla would still be problematic. That said, not everything in here is so bad if you take the time to actually explore everything. Each of the 4 pathways has a linear set of challenges leading to one of those switches, with a heavy emphasis on side-scrolling sections. I mentioned this already when looking at Suthorn Ruins, but the side-scrolling sections in this game feel a lot more intentionally integrated as thought-out parts of the level design, and this is one of the dungeons where that shows the most. It feels like nearly half of this place is set in an underwater, side-scrolling section, and I do find them fun to comb through while trying to manage your air gauge. There's some fun little individual room challenges here as well, which either involve combat, a bit of cleverness, or some creative thinking. This room, for example, has a strong water current, which prevents you from using those water blocks. I also like the way these paths all loop back on themselves, essentially giving you a shortcut back to the central room once you've completed the task in each route. That's a clever bit of design. But then, that's about it. The map and boss key are tucked along these various routes, but that's about the entirety of the dungeon. This is without a doubt the shortest and most compact dungeon in the game. Even the starter dungeon before this is more sprawling and expansive by comparison, which feels weird to me, like a regression in design. But once we've found the boss key in this little pocket of air and reached the top floor of the central room, we can unlock this door and confront the dungeon boss. This is Vocavor, who you may recall from that chase sequence at the start of the dungeon. I guess he's back to finish the job. Unfortunately, he's a bit of a pushover. This boss is not at all hard to take down. Vocavor does look pretty good though. They could have gone the route of making this just the Anglerfish version 2, but they opted for something a little more distinct, with a weak spot that visually stands out, making the fight overall pretty intuitive. That's not a bad thing, and I don't mind an early game boss being a bit on the easier side. But I do think that the Seismic Talus proved to be a bit more of a challenge, so it's all a bit backwards. He'll mostly use those same vortex attacks, much like was teased to us at the start of the dungeon, albeit smaller here, with a few more physical tail attacks thrown in the mix as well. The strategy here is as you'd expect: send some echoes after his weak point, or attack it directly with sword fighter form. When all his weird little pustule things are burst, he'll be stunned and vulnerable. Deal damage, avoid his attacks, rinse, repeat. So, since his weak point is on his back, the fight becomes about avoidance and carefully positioning yourself and your echoes appropriately, which is good. There is also a second phase where the water drains out of certain parts of the room, which makes that aforementioned positioning a little more difficult, since you can't necessarily just swim there anymore. But again, with either a little bit of patience or the right echoes, this is still very manageable. manageable. And then he dies. Overall though, I don't have much more to say about Vocavor. Vocavor? I don't know how to pronounce this guy's name. He goes down very quickly. I think he's a fine boss, but not a great one, which stings a little more after seeing how well the last boss was designed. And if you did the Gerudo Sanctum before this dungeon, like I did on my first playthrough, then you're really going to feel that plummet in difficulty curve even more. This is overall my least favorite boss fight in the game. It's not a terrible one, but I would rank every other boss in the game above it. So, overall, Jabul Ruins is a pretty lackluster dungeon. There are some good things here. I like how the intro segment, after the foyer floor collapses, teases the boss to you. I like some of these puzzles that have you activating shock switches. I like the dark underwater section that makes both air and light a resource that you have to manage. But I think I would have preferred that they took a single idea, or even just a small handful of them, and fleshed them out in greater detail, because each one of these things is kind of a flash in the pan, or just a one-off thing. As it stands right now, I don't think I could put my finger on a single core dungeon mechanic or gimmick here, aside from it's a terminal-style dungeon. That ends up falling apart too once you realize that if you know what you're doing, you can skip almost the entirety of this dungeon, utterly breaking it apart. At least in the Divine Beasts of Breath of the Wild, you have to push all of the buttons. All you need to complete this dungeon is to scoop up the boss key from the northeast passage, and then make your way to the boss door. There's nothing stopping you from doing that and skipping the other 80% of the dungeon. It's a terminal-style dungeon where you don't even have to activate the terminals. I'm far from the only one to point this out, but to offer a counter to my own point, and a key piece of the argument that I think often gets omitted or glossed over, is that in order to do so, you have to know that that is an option. You have to have prior knowledge of where things actually are. Knowledge usually gained from actually doing the dungeon. So I'm sure most people didn't run into this as an issue. However, when you have the path to the boss key available so immediately, no matter how unlikely it is, it remains a possibility that this could end up being someone's experience in the dungeon, ruining it through the simple act of wanting to explore, something that is usually encouraged. So in the interest of being constructive, here's a couple of ideas that could have worked. These aren't original ideas either. I've plucked them all from other Zelda games, but I think these would work to fix the issues with this dungeon. One is that rather than a boss key, there could have been a giant mechanical lock that gets opened in segments by the 4 switches you have to press, just like the final trial in Breath of the Wild. You could also have a series of locked blocks or doors between the central room and the boss door, not unlike the lead up towards the boss of Key Cavern in Link's Awakening. Then, by spreading small keys throughout the dungeon, you make sure that players have to explore thoroughly. Or if that doesn't feel right, you could even just break the boss key into key fragments and scatter those around instead, a concept we've really only seen in the Goron mines of Twilight Princess, which I actually think would be better suited to an open-ended dungeon like this one, rather than the linear layout of that one. But in the end, what we got was a very short, mediocre water dungeon, one with loads of missed potential. In the southwest corner of Hyrule, we'll find the Gerudo Desert, which is undergoing something of a crisis. Several rifts have opened in the already harsh region. The Gerudo warriors attempting to deal with the issue are reaching exhaustion, and the chief's advisor Facet has been replaced by an imposter, intentionally guiding the people of the desert in the wrong direction. After repeated failure to close the smaller rifts of the region, Zelda Zelda joins with the chief's daughter Donna and rallies the Gerudo soldiers, proving herself and rescuing the real Facet from the still world. With the tools and knowledge in our hands, we are granted access to the Gerudo Sanctum, where Tri's friends are being imprisoned, which itself has been plunged into the still world. So, here we are. Having been run back and forth throughout the desert, Zelda finds herself in the next dungeon. What is it about desert-themed dungeons in Zelda games? They are somehow consistently great, and the Gerudo Sanctum is no exception. This dungeon, while intuitive enough to be in the early game, is still a fairly good winding maze of a dungeon. It has a mostly linear setup overall, but still has branching paths and elbow room for how you complete certain objectives and in what order. It's a great balance, but before we get into that, let's take a look at the architecture. This was actually something I was worried about when I first got here. The first few rooms gave me the impression that this would be a rather visually bland dungeon with beiges and browns and nothing more, but that's not the case. This dungeon has some excellent use of color to highlight important rooms and elements, giving a visual vibrance that I wish Suthorn had, while still being distinctly a desert dungeon. This is not to say that the beiges and browns aren't here, they absolutely are. I mean, look at all this sand. But they're not the only thing here. Besides, it just makes the deliberate use of colors stand out even more. Interactable objects are bright blues, pots with resources are a teal that just pops, important rooms get a particular bit of visual flair, and most importantly, of course, the animal statues that are the crux of the dungeon's main puzzle are all vibrantly colored with gold accents. Between that and the colorful cast of enemies found here, this is frankly a fantastic looking dungeon. To go along with that, the dungeon music is just about perfect. It fits the theme and uses the type of instrumentation that you'd expect from a desert-themed dungeon. All that good stuff. They aren't exactly breaking new ground with the instrument choices, but that's okay. Most importantly, it is just superbly catchy and intense all at once. I've been listening to it on repeat while writing this script, and it genuinely gets me hyped up. There's just such an exciting energy to it. Blending the usual desert elements with the droning of the still world theme, as has been the case with all of the dungeons so far, mind you, but of the first 3 dungeons' themes, this is the best so far. As for navigation, the Sanctum provides a great balance between linearity and open-ended, branching paths. There are quite a few instances in which you'll have options of where to go, but you'll still need to complete the objectives behind both paths. Or sometimes you'll run into a locked door and have to go hunting elsewhere for keys. Oh wow. That feels good to say. There's also an emphasis here on the exterior of the dungeon, specifically this section of the still world. Both Suthorn and Jabul Ruins have been in the still world as well, but used that setting as a linear platforming style lead up to the dungeon, basically meaning you'd first go through the still world, reach the dungeon, and then go inside and complete the dungeon itself. They were 2 separate, distinct gameplay sections. This time, the lines are a little more blurred. The still world outside is not a linear platforming section, but instead a sprawling open space that surrounds the dungeon on all sides. Well, almost. The bottom's cut off, but The building itself has multiple entrances, so you'll find yourself going in and out in order to make progress and explore new parts of the dungeon, finding new ways to get inside as you do, not unlike the Skull Woods dungeon way back in A Link to the Past. I like this concept quite a lot. And while it's an idea that will get put to even better use later in the game, I think it's used really nicely here. And there's even mandatory stuff to find out here, so it isn't just flavor. In fact, the dungeon exterior with its multiple entrances and exits pretty well acts as the dungeon's central room. Initially, when studying the map and looking over my footage, I was going to say that the dungeon doesn't really have one, and I guess that's true since this isn't technically a room per se, but it serves the same function, acting as a memorable anchor, a focal point from which your exploration can spiral outward from, while keeping your sense of direction grounded by having it all connect back to an important location. So yeah, outside is the central room. I've convinced myself. Progression-wise, after a short section at the beginning where we have to hunt down a key with the option to get the flying tile echo, we'll be strung past a buried boss door and then find ourselves at this room with some pedestals and a stone tablet. It's here that we'll learn the dungeon's core puzzle, which the rest of the progression is built around. Something of a riddle. Find 2 specific animal statues, the descriptions of which we'll find elsewhere in the dungeon, and place them here on their pedestals to open the way. Once we've done that, it'll loop us into this room, so we can drain the sand out from beneath the boss door and get the boss key from this cool rotating puzzle. So we have a clear objective and are given free reign throughout the dungeon to find these hints, the correct statues, and a few other goodies along the way. This is overall a great dungeon setup, and the animal statues themselves are spread out really nicely throughout the dungeon and its exterior. Even if you know the solution or remember it from a previous playthrough in my case, you still have to go get them, meaning this is not a cheesable dungeon where you can just go straight to the boss key and bypass everything else, even though you have a lot of options on how to approach things. We also get a decent mid-boss fight here, something Jabul Ruins lacked entirely, once again facing off against a Link Echo. This time he uses the bow rather than the sword. Then he multiplies, making you fight multiple at once. This is a pretty fun little battle, though maybe not as intense as the encounter in Suthorn. There's also a good variety of ways to take them on, whether it be with echoes, using bind to just drop him into the abyss, or taking him head on with sword fighter form. All in all, a decent mid-boss, if not a little on the easy side. Defeating him will give us access to the bow, which, like the sword, acts like something of a dungeon item here, which is cool. It greatly bolsters your attack capabilities while in sword fighter form, which especially helps during boss fights. But for the puzzle and navigation side of things, it's used in the most minimal and bare bones way possible. There's one instance where it's helpful, and that's to break this particular barrier blocking this path in a side-scrolling section. That's cool. I always like when new items open access to new areas, but they placed this barrier in the room right after you get the bow, and it's the only one like it in the dungeon. If they had placed a second one elsewhere in the dungeon, just to spice up the sequence of progression with a little more utility, I think it would make the navigation just that much more interesting, but oh well. I also want to give a quick mention to the flying tile echo. We can find it pretty early on in the dungeon, in this room, and it almost acts like a cheeky little dungeon item itself, allowing you to cross long gaps or attack from a distance. While navigating the still world outside the sanctum, this ends up being invaluable, but it has lots of potential use cases all over the place. I love this little thing, and it feels like such a significantly useful tool without feeling utterly game-breaking. So overall, we've got a couple of dungeon item stand-ins, which greatly increase showcase what we're capable of here by providing us with some ranged attacks and a little extra mobility, and I'm all about it. There's one more little mechanic that I want to highlight here as well, which I think is implemented quite well. It's the ability to use bind to rotate certain interactable objects. We'll first encounter something like this in this room near where we found the flying tile, on our way to finding the first small key. We're never really told that this is something we can use bind for, but the environmental context clues in this room should be enough for most people to piece together that we can do something with this door. Between the handles, the scrapings on the floor, and the coloration being different than the walls, it all just screams rotating door to me, and we've already used bind to pull things lots of times by now. We'll find a couple more of these doors later on in the dungeon, including this one that's a little more well hidden, blending into the wall, but still telegraphed with the floor scrapings. Outside, we'll find rotating sections of pillars with the same handles, expanding on the concept. These flamethrowers have the same handles too, and what do you know? We can turn them. This all culminates in a final puzzle, with these rotating sections that you need to line up in order to get the boss key, which initially uses this rotating wheel as a control, but then needs some additional adjustments with bind to make work. I love it. The room is visually pleasing, and the puzzle, while not too difficult, is a fun little piece of architecture. Besides, I just like when puzzles iterate on themselves like that, starting out quite easy and getting a little more complicated as the dungeon goes on. Of course, once we've drained this sand, just like we did at the dungeon entrance, and completed this puzzle to get the boss key, we'll be looped back upstairs where we can confront the dungeon boss. Rising from the sand to meet us is Mogriff. Whoa, nice shades. As far as desert-themed dungeon bosses go, this is a pretty neat concept. I guess he's like the mole version of a griffin, and we have seen a fair amount of both hole mills and flying enemies, so this works for me. The sunglasses look a little silly, but otherwise, I kinda like his design. He's big and beastly. As for actually fighting Mogriff, I honestly find this boss fight to be a lot of fun. He's a genuinely good boss that will keep you constantly moving as he aggressively attacks and zooms around the room himself. He'll slash at you with his claws, which also sends a sandy shockwave out, and charge directly at you. Since he moves around a lot, it can seem tricky to reliably attack him, but if you time it right, you can get him to bonk his head on one of these statues, which will leave him momentarily stunned and vulnerable. There's also a second phase to the fight, where the top layer of sand in the room drains, leaving us in the sink sand below, save for a few safe spots. Hopefully, you bought those sandals in Gerudo Town. At this point, he'll also put those wings to use, flying and expanding his repertoire of attacks with sand tornadoes and dives. The tactic remains the same though overall, just with some added challenge and mobility, and I like that. Like the Seismic Talus in Suthorn, this boss really feels like a great blend between old school Zelda boss, in which they have a specific weakness that will stun them and allow you to shift from defensive to offensive, and open air Zelda boss, in which you can just wail on them and chip away at their health unrestricted with a variety of attack options. Both approaches are possible here, but I feel that being strategic tends to pay off better than just being super aggressive, which fits the game's theme of, wisdom. It's in the title. All of that said, I like this big hairy goof. An original boss that fits the theme here, and is a ton of fun to take on. Plus, something about moles in sunglasses is weirdly amusing to me. Good stuff. So, Overall, Gerudo Sanctum is a pretty great dungeon, one that succeeds in just about every way that Jabul Ruins failed. It gracefully balances its linear sequences with open-endedness, while not diluting the navigation to the point of abysmal simplicity. Plus, it has a fun boss fight at the end to boot. The dungeon also heavily incorporates a core puzzle, as I mentioned earlier, and I seriously worried about the cheese factor here for repeat playthroughs. It almost becomes a mini Metroidvania, an emerging game genre that uses knowledge as a gate rather than or in addition to in-game keys or abilities. But it manages to avoid the pitfalls of such a genre because even if you know the puzzle solution, that being which statues you need to place on these pedestals, you still have to find those statues, so you can't totally cheese the dungeon by bypassing everything if you have prior knowledge of the dungeon, and that's good stuff. Even if you know which statues you need and where they are, it's still a task to get there, especially the elephant statue, which is tucked quite deep into the dungeon. There is something to be said about how this dungeon falls into the game's overall difficulty curve. For an early game dungeon, this feels just about right to me. It's a good step up in challenge from Suthorn, but it's never unfair or punishing. A few more stray thoughts I have. I really like the puzzles that use hole mills to access areas below you. It works almost like an inverse of Tears of the Kingdom's Ascend ability, but going down, and with greater limitation since it only works on a certain terrain. This one room teases you with a treasure chest and hints towards the puzzle with sand dripping down from the ceiling. Meanwhile, on the roof outside, there's a suspicious patch of sand here, which leads down into that room. It's just a neat little puzzle, and I'm a big fan of environmental context clues like that. The enemy variety here is pretty good too. We've got Aerorudas, Gibdos, Poes, Mothulas, and more. It's great to see, and they add a lot of flavor to the dungeon while not relying on just frequently locking you in a room filled with enemies. I mean, it happens a couple times, but that's fine. It never feels like a design crutch. Besides, I can't think of very many Zelda dungeons where that doesn't happen at least once. These pulley switches to open doors are pretty cool. Reminds me of Twilight Princess, and you can grab and pull them manually or use bind. So that's fun. I just wanted to mention it. I didn't know where to fit it in the script. All that said, I think this dungeon's greatest strength is in how it just lets you roam freely, explore, and figure it out for yourself. Jabul was meant to be open-ended, but its design really was just 4 looped paths off of a central room. This place has so much explorable space by comparison, both inside and out of the sanctum itself, treating the surrounding still world area as a large part of the dungeon progression, even hiding one of the necessary animal statues out there. The multiple entrances and exits and abundance of optional goodies and secrets to collect actually play really nicely into the massive toolkit that the game arms you with. And unlike Jabul, I never felt like my huge arsenal of echoes undermined the dungeon progression or its puzzles in any way, but rather played into it. Plus, zooming around on the flying tile is a ton of fun. All of this is to say, I like this dungeon quite a lot. After closing the rifts of both Jabul Waters and the Gerudo Desert, the missing King of Hyrule remains unaccounted for. General Wright, with Minister left in tow, decides that it's time to head back to the castle rather than sit idly by. But as Zelda approaches the Castletown gate, a rift expands from within the castle, swallowing most of the town itself. After a brief bit of combat in what's left of the plaza, we once again must enter the still world in order to mend the rift and rescue all of the townspeople who were pulled inside, leading us to the next dungeon. If If I had a nickel for every time we went to Hyrule Castle near the start of the game, then returned here after completing 3 dungeons before being set out to do the rest of the game's dungeons, well, I guess I'd have 4 nickels. That's actually less than I expected. Oh well, either way. We're in pretty familiar territory here. Hyrule Castle itself has had numerous appearances throughout the series, and while the floor plan and layout have changed quite dramatically over the years, there's always a sort of familiar feeling whenever revisiting this place. Even more so in this case, since we've quite literally explored a fair amount of the castle already earlier in the game. In terms of architecture, the castle is pretty much exactly what you'd expect, but it looks great. Stone walls and bricks adorned with torches and ornate floor tiles, that sort of thing. The royal crest is plastered all over the place, and is that a loft wing? Makes sense. Additionally, the castle feels very lived in, with extra doors that are purely set decoration, implying a much larger building than what we can actually explore. The storage rooms in the basement, meanwhile, are crammed full of stuff, which gives the feeling of this place being actually functional as a castle with a large staff. All of that stuff makes for good world building, both when we were here near the start of the game and now with the castle being ripped apart and suspended in the still world. Visually, everything here looks and feels great. The music here is pretty good too. It's plenty dramatic, blending the castle theme that the game uses outside of the dungeon scenario with elements of danger pulled from elsewhere, such as the still world theme, the Breath of the Wild castle theme, the classic Hyrule Castle theme from A Link to the Past. Also, there's this one part that sounds almost like Tri's sad little vocalizations. It's faint, but I swear it's mixed in with the song. Overall, this isn't my favorite track in the game, nor is it my favorite of the castle's many themes that it's had over the years. But I can't deny that it fits here really well. It suits this section of the game wonderfully, even if it leans a little hard on those bagpipes at times. So yeah, it's a good track. Not a mind-blowingly amazing one, but a good one. The dungeon itself works quite nicely as what I'm calling an interlude dungeon, that being a dungeon with lots of tough enemies that acts as a clear division between the game's first and second act, containing a big story beat. A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds uses Hyrule Castle in the same way, after completing the beginning dungeons, giving you a gauntlet of combat challenges before setting you back into the world to explore freely and tackle the next set of dungeons. So there is precedent for this sort of thing. Between that story significance, the moody aesthetics of the still world, and the music, everything feels just the right amount of tense and dramatic. But that also feeds into the overall sense of accomplishment here as we get through the castle's various challenges. Progression through the castle can be divided into 2 distinct gameplay sections. First, there's a strictly linear section, which includes some side-scrolling rooms and a reverse version of the castle's stealth section. We'll be retreading the main halls, some secret passageways, and the castle basement that we escaped from earlier in the game. If caught, you'll be penalized with a short combat encounter, but nothing unmanageable. Well, these rooms look cool though. A lot of people aren't big on stealth sections in Zelda games, and I get it, but this one works for me. There's a lot of options for how to approach things, even more than earlier in the game, just by virtue of us having more echoes to play around with. I just have fun using flying tiles to breeze over the guards' heads, or spawning shrubbery to box them into corners. But yeah, returning to this area after getting a few dungeons under our belt works to reinforce that sense of player growth, since it's a pretty explicit showcase of how much more capable we are than the start of the game. And there's an inherent satisfaction to that, if you ask me. We'll also find Impa locked in the very same cell that we were in at the start of the game. I guess she could only take on so many of these guys before they locked her up, but her inclusion here is a great touch. The second section is where the dungeon opens up a little bit more. This part is almost like a mini tangled knot sequence, with a few branching paths, which will see us crisscrossing this area in order to find the boss key, which we first need to get this small key for. The puzzles here are mostly throwback puzzles that revisit concepts from the previous dungeons, such as torch lighting like in Suthorn, treasure being hidden in the sand like the Gerudo Sanctum, and having to navigate underwater in the dark and fighting water currents like in Jabul. It's cool to see them incorporating all of these elements here. There's a fair amount of sequencing while still giving you room to explore and plenty of options on how to tackle things, so that's good stuff. And a lot of these paths will loop back in on themselves, making navigation streamlined without diluting that sense of exploration, since you still have keys and locked doors to contend with. The dungeon is a bit on the shorter side, however, an issue that I think most of this game's dungeons suffer from, but it won't take long before you manage to track down the boss key. So with that said, let's talk about the dungeon boss. Here in the depths of the castle dungeon, we'll find the three imposters posing as Minister Left, General Right, and the King of Hyrule. But before long, they'll drop the ruse, revealing Ganon. He's back, baby. Sorta. Alright, here we go again. Ganon looks great here. No notes. They perfectly adapted his classic design into this game's art style, likely taking a lot of cues from the brief Nightmare Ganon appearance from the Link's Awakening remake. But he's not just a shadow here. He's rendered in all his detailed glory, and I'm all about it. Though his voice cracks me up, he truly just sounds like an angry guy more than a beast. The fight itself will go pretty well just like the Ganon encounter in the game's prologue, but harder, of course. He's far more aggressive than the previous bosses that we've encountered. Now that we're playing as Zelda instead of Link, we also have many more viable methods for approaching the battle. Leaning on echoes to deal damage totally works, but I'm old-fashioned, I guess, so I tend to just use the tried and true strategy of avoiding his attacks and waiting for an opportunity to strike, then rushing at him with sword fighter form. The easiest opening being when he throws his trident like this. During the battle's second phase, he'll launch into the classic Dead Man's Volley, a trope that I frankly never get tired of. If you take the bait and deflect his energy balls, then you'll have to go back and forth a bit, with the speed increasing with each deflection. This ends up getting pretty fast, narrowing your window of timing as it goes. But the payoff here is that successfully hitting him with his own attack will leave him stunned and vulnerable, as you'd expect. Aside from Dead Man's Volley, the rest of Ganon's own moveset is likewise packed, with callbacks to previous iterations of Ganon battles. He uses his trident to summon fire bats, launching them at you. He lunges, stabs, and throws the trident itself, and teleports around the room. While this is far from unique, it's really the midpoint of the game, and to be honest, you don't always need to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes tried and true design methods can still make for a fun boss fight. Aside from that, I don't really have much more to say. It is stuff we've seen before, and by that same token, stuff that I've already talked about in other videos, but I sincerely have a ton of fun fighting this guy. So overall, Hyrule Castle is not an extraordinary dungeon, but it works nicely as that interlude-style dungeon to break up the game's first and second tiers of dungeons. Like previous iterations of the Castle Second Visit, this version throws lots of tough enemies at you, including level 2 Darknuts and a ball and chain trooper. But of course it's not just a combat gauntlet. We have puzzles and even some navigational deviations here. It all acts nicely as a big story beat for the game, and while I wish it lasted a few rooms longer, what we do have here is well designed. A few more stray thoughts I have though. This place has so many treasure chests, 11 by my count, but for how short of a dungeon this is, that is a lot packed into not a lot of space. Near the end of the dungeon, we'll find the frog ring in one of them, and it is absolutely wonderful. It doubles the height of our jumps. This may already sound useful for just getting around normally, but this also makes using certain echoes much easier to do. This applies to things like plat booms as well, and every time I've started a new playthrough of this game, I have winced a little at the default jump height. It's a little stat boost that makes a monumental difference at all times. I didn't mention this earlier in the video, but Zelda has a cat, which we see at the beginning of the game, and then gets caught here in the still world. The amount of relief I get at the end of the dungeon seeing it back is immense. I like cats, okay? After the boss fight, there's a quick cutscene where a big monster breaks through the wall. We'll talk about this guy again later in the series, but then Link shows up and beats him back with a literal stick. And I just think that's so incredibly on brand and hilarious. This is also the part of the game where we get some time in the castle to play in this outfit with the hood down. And you should look into the hashtag hoodless Zelda movement to learn more about that. But yeah, otherwise, the dungeon itself is enjoyable enough. A healthy balance of side-scrolling sections, linearity, unique scenarios, and navigational challenge. Far from the high point of this game, the best dungeons are still to come, but for what is essentially an interlude, it's a lot of fun. Link has been captured, and though the imposters who had taken control of Hyrule's government have been dealt with, new rifts have opened up around the kingdom, the locations of which coincide with a legend regarding a certain prime energy. Zelda is tasked with mending the rifts and rescuing Link in order to unite against their unseen enemy. Or are they unseen? Meanwhile, up Eldin Volcano, the rifts here have swallowed a portion of Goron City and its inhabitants, including the newly appointed chief, Darstan. After Zelda is able to rescue him from the still world, the two begin working together to collect information from the Goron elders. Unlike his father, who he has taken over as chief for, Darstan isn't particularly headstrong. He's more of a bookworm than most Gorons, and has a tendency to overthink things, but through working with Zelda, he learns some valuable lessons about leadership, leaning too much on the past, and doing things his own way. With Darstan's help, we're able to eventually make our way through these volcanic caverns, where we can make an entrance to the still world. After a bit of platforming around these stilled volcanic landscapes, we'll find ourselves at the entrance to the next dungeon. I can't talk about Eldin Temple without first addressing the music, because frankly, it's amazing. This is one of my favorite pieces of dungeon music in the whole series. Like, why is it so good? Mostly strings, it's tense and dramatic, and really gets me moving. Like, literally, I start bobbing in my seat with this song playing. Zelda's fire dungeons, historically, have often gone for more atmospheric tracks. Turtle Rock, Dodongo's Cavern, the Fire Temple, Dragon Roost Cavern, and the Goron Mines all leaned in that direction, but that's not always the case, and this is one of the exceptions. They did not hold back on this one. It's up there with the likes of Skyward Sword's Earth Temple as just being so full of energy. It's good stuff, and feels just the right amount of dangerous for such a hazardous environment. As for visuals, there isn't much in the way of architecture to speak of here. The dungeon almost entirely uses a cavernous, stony aesthetic. At a glance, there's only a few seemingly man-made parts, like the doorways, these floor tiles in a few spots, and debatably these rock climbing walls, though it could be argued that the Gorons, who are known for simple stonework, intentionally used a very natural looking design. The stone walls almost seem to have an interlocking scale-like pattern to them. It appears very uniform, and there are rooms with simple paintings on the walls to highlight the consistency in size of these stones. So maybe there was a more deliberate building process than I assumed initially. As for actually playing through the dungeon, ironically perhaps, this is one of the weaker aspects of Eldin Temple. It's not a particularly long or complex dungeon, with only 3 floors, 2 of which have only 3 rooms each. A good chunk of the dungeon, about a third of it, is spread out between the various side-scrolling sections. These are either used to bridge floors, or seemingly disconnected parts of the map, though in general I prefer the former approach more than the latter. Having a side-scrolling room essentially be an extension of a staircase works neatly for me, adding an extra layer to exploring between multiple floors. As for the other approach, well, I know that when talking about Link's Awakening's dungeons, I talked a lot about not liking these, and how it often felt like a band-aid solution to working around the dungeon's layouts. This game handles it a little better in my opinion, by not only making the side-scrolling rooms more interesting and elaborate in and of themselves, but by just better integrating them into the dungeon layouts in general. Though the map screen could display them better, as I mentioned when looking at Suthorn, I never really feel like it's an unnatural or disjointed part of the progression in this game. I feel Link's Awakening has better dungeons overall, but I think this one aspect of its design is improved upon here. That said though, of all this game's dungeons, I think Eldin Temple is the one to handle the concept best. It feels like a dungeon built around playing in this style more than the others do. One of these side-scrolling rooms even acts as a sort of central room for the final chunk of the dungeon, with locked doors, branching paths, and keys to grab. That heavy integration of this viewpoint also goes hand in hand with the dungeon's heavier emphasis on platforming. The overall navigation is a bit on the simpler side here, so instead, the challenge leans more on having the dungeon feel like something of an obstacle course. There are pitfalls with updrafts to glide over, pools of magma, and of course those aforementioned rock climbing walls. In quite a lot of these rooms, the magma also raises and lowers, so you can add a sense of timing to the echo bridging puzzle platforming, and things get a lot more interesting. The dungeon also features our third mid-boss fight against Link, or rather a Link Echo. This time, he spams bombs at you, both the regular variety and the mobile bomb chews. Nice to see them back. This is probably the easiest of the 3 battles against him, since the bombs are fairly easy to avoid. Plus, the room is filled with these destructible blocks, which will get blown up by the enemy's bombs, dropping hearts and energy pickups to refill your sword fighter gauge. He moves around a lot, so I guess the challenge is meant to be just staying on him, but But honestly, Zelda is a speedy climber, even without equipping a climbing speed buff, so I never found myself really struggling to get my attacks in. Honestly, it's a little strange to me. The battle against Link in Suthorn really set a high bar, but every Link fight after that one has gotten easier and easier, like it's not scaling enough with how powerful the player is growing. Alas, defeating him rewards us with what is essentially the dungeon item, bombs, as you'd expect, which would be cool if not for the fact that we should already have both bombfish and zero echoes by this point in the game, which we can summon with very little restriction, whereas using bombs in sword fighter form comes at severe limitation by comparison, since it's tied to your energy gauge, making this a frankly underwhelming inclusion. The bombfish especially overshadow this ability, since you can use them in much the same way already without draining your energy. You can also spawn them at a distance, and you have unlimited of them. The only drawback is that they tend to wriggle around a bit, but you can either hold them in place or use bind on them, and they won't damage you. Zero, meanwhile, are all over Eldin, and even as enemies, may inadvertently bomb stuff in earlier rooms of the dungeon for you. It just feels to me like bombs were included in your sword fighter kit out of some obligation more than for any real intended use case. In order to secure the boss key, which is hidden in a passage that requires a small key to get to, we'll have to trek down this long vertical chamber, which isn't too hard. The challenge kicks in once we've gotten the boss key itself, as this turns into a brief escape sequence. The lava will begin to rise, and since we don't want to die a fiery death, we have to book it. Nothing unmanageable, but it's a fun little bit of action, especially as the final ladder breaks, forcing you to come up with an alternative on the fly. I like stuff like this, little bits of tension and then relief. That said, I kinda wish this sequence was about 50% longer. It goes by real fast, like it ends right as the going gets good, which is a statement that can apply to the dungeon as a whole. We've got a tangly little area that winds in and out of itself, where we use bombs to break through obstacles, have to find a couple of keys to nab the boss key, and then open the way forward, and a big magma-filled area to traverse through. All very exciting. And then we reach the boss door. It feels like just as things are getting really fun in here, the dungeon politely comes to a close. But with the boss key in hand, we can unlock this door, and in what feels like a callback to the end of Dodongo's Cavern, jump down this pit in order to confront the dungeon boss. Emerging from the lava is a fiery, serpentine dragon. It's Volvagia, making a return from Ocarina of Time, and he looks great. He's perfectly adapted to this game's art style while still being true to his original design from the N64 days. Besides, who doesn't love a good dragon fight? By the same token, the fight itself follows the same principle, true to the original design, but adapted to this game. We aren't using a megaton hammer this time around, but there are similarities to that classic battle while putting Zelda's new moveset to use. Essentially, his behavior remains largely consistent with the Ocarina of Time version of Volvagia, alternating between flying out of reach, breathing fire, and popping out of holes below the arena. But with different tools at our disposal, things play out differently here. The most effective way I've found to tackle the fight is to use bind to pull on his big glowing necklace in order to stun him, which is conveniently color-coded as green to hint at this, then getting in close either with echoes or sword fighter form in order to deal damage. Easy, right? Well, as an added wrinkle to things, this is the most hazardous boss arena in the game, being broken up into smaller platforms and, of course, being surrounded by lava. Spicy. So in addition to avoiding his attacks, we also have to be mindful of our footing, which especially comes into play during those moments when we can use Bind on him, since he'll take that opportunity to charge up a powerful breath attack, and you only have so much room to move around in to avoid it. For this point in the game, it's honestly nice to see the challenge ramp up a bit. This also is the one that feels the most like a classic Zelda boss so far in the game, aside from Ganon himself, of course. And that's probably because it largely just is one. You know the drill. Wait for the right timing, stun him, then deal damage. He's even immune to arrows while flying around, so it's very timing dependent. But you know what? I like that. I like that we have a mix of different boss styles, some being more traditionally designed than others. That's cool. But most importantly of all, I have so much fun here during this battle. Every time I've done this fight, I've just found myself grinning. What a great inclusion, and of course, a fitting battle to conclude this fiery dungeon. Good to see you again, Volvagia, and rest in peace. So overall, Eldin Temple is a perfectly average fire dungeon. Maybe a notch above average, I'm not sure. There's a lot of good things going on in here, but it never quite feels like it reaches the level of excellence that I expect from the series. And I think that length plays a big part in that. The dungeon is quite short. Remember what I said earlier about the escape sequence where we get the boss key, that it should have been about 50% longer? I think that applies to the entire dungeon. There's a sense of escalation here, with challenges getting just a little bit more interesting as the dungeon goes on. But the whole thing comes to an end before it gets to a point where it goes from good to great. Another part of my feelings towards this may stem from the fact that I'm a big puzzle guy. My favorite types of dungeons are the ones that feel like big, winding, tangled knots that you have to pick apart bit by bit. And this dungeon is not quite that, leaning more into being a gauntlet style instead. I mean, kind of. There are a few forks in the road, with keys and locked doors, and that's great, but it's far from complex feeling. I'd argue that the main focus of this dungeon seems to be on platforming rather than navigation. Granted, I'm not saying this is like a Mario level. In fact, I think it's at its best when it leans into what I'm calling puzzle platforming, by having us use our echoes to work around problems and overcome the various obstacles that it throws at us. That's cool, but I just wish there was a little bit more to it. Because of the lack of real navigational challenge and the overall short length, it almost feels like a bit of a step backwards compared to, say, Gerudo Sanctum, which was great. I do like some of these individual puzzles on their own though, particularly when we have long gaps to cross and the only thing holding us back is our echo limit and imagination. Or sometimes it's a matter of moving around the platforms that are already in here. And there's this one puzzle where the treasure chest containing the map is blocked on either side by hot geysers. So you can either use echoes to block the steam off, or use bind to just move the chest to a safer location. Either way is perfectly valid, and I like those moments where it gives you pause so you can assess the situation and think, how do I get that? I like overcoming those moments, though I am curious how other people manage to get past this puzzle. This ladder is blocked by destructible blocks, and using bombs to destroy them is a little on the trickier side, so I just end up floating over the ledge with water blocks instead. But let me know how you did it. But honestly, it feels bad to say it, but the music kinda is the best part of the dungeon. That theme is absolutely fantastic, and you can probably expect it to show up in future videos when fire dungeons come up. I don't see myself getting tired of it. Though speaking of music, the boss music for Volvagia here is fine, but there's a part of me that wishes they had done a remix of the old Volvagia theme instead. I know this is a minor point, and in general, I tend to lean towards preferring original stuff rather than just rehashing things we've seen a bunch of times already. But when it's literally the same boss, it's hard not to compare them. And that original theme from Ocarina of Time was frankly so good. As nostalgic as those old sound fonts are, there's a part of me that would have loved to have heard it get a modern adaptation. But really, again, this is a minor point, and so not a big deal. So yeah, Eldin Temple is good, not great. And frankly, I wish it had taken the plunge of being just a little longer and a little more complex, but otherwise it's a good dungeon, just not an amazing one. I like what's here, I just wanted to get a little more out of it. Isolated from the rest of Hyrule, the Faron Wetlands is a rather uninviting destination, populated by the mistrustful, trend-seeking Deku scrubs. Though adorable, the Deku people can be ruthless and selfish in their efforts to chase the latest big thing. When a rift opens up in the wetlands, they develop a community-wide obsession with cotton candy made from spiderwebs. Ugh. On her quest to mend the rifts, Zelda finds herself thrown in prison for disrupting the supply chain. But after something of a prison escape, the princess comes into possession of a membership card, granting her access to the Scrub's sweet spot. From here, we can enter the expanding rifts and journey through the still world, where we'll find the next dungeon. Welcome to Faron Temple, arguably the best dungeon in the game, or at least it's in the top 3. But before we spend any time inside, we have to look at the temple exterior, because the surrounding still world area is just as much a part of the dungeon as the rooms inside are, even more so than Gerudo Sanctum. Taking cues from the Skull Woods dungeon of A Link to the Past, a large part of the dungeon exploration here leans on exploring outside and finding different ways into the various sections of the dungeon. And it's great. There's even a room fully dependent on this, with no connecting hallway through the dungeon exterior. This exterior area also offers a nice counter to the inside of the dungeon. Instead of dark, cramped corridors, it's a big open space, and rather than containing clear puzzles, it's packed with enemies and obstacles. Those various entryways into the dungeon are nicely hidden as well, with really only the main entrance into the dungeon's central room being obvious. The rest, while not too hard to find, get tucked into various corners or underwater or even behind webs and statues. By my count, there are 7 entrances, though that doesn't mean the dungeon is disjointed or segmented. Aside from that one previously mentioned isolated room, the dungeon weaves together, interconnected like a tangled web of rooms, branching out of a notable central chamber with doors on all sides. The architecture is okay, nothing to write home about. It definitely evokes ancient jungle temple though, with stonework falling into disrepair, swaths of green, and plant overgrowth everywhere. I don't necessarily find it extraordinary, but I still like it a lot. I think I have a soft spot for jungle and forest themed dungeons in general though. I like the greenery, though I think I've been starved for this type of dungeon theming a bit, since neither Breath of the Wild nor Tears of the Kingdom really had any sort of forest temple. That said, it also finds ways to visually stand out through its use of lighting. We'll find several rooms cloaked in darkness, requiring us to navigate in low visibility and find torches to light. I've said this in previous videos already, but I always love when dungeons use darkness like this. It just adds another layer to the navigation and the overall tone, and it is used to great effect here. The atmosphere is wonderful and mysterious, which is conveyed both through that deep-rooted sense of exploration illumination and that careful use of darkness itself. It all reminds me a bit of Woodfall Temple from Majora's Mask, actually, which likewise had a lot of flowery Deku architecture, dark rooms, and plant overgrowth. Contributing to those wonderful vibes is the dungeon music. This is a great track, one I've been enamored with while writing this script. Maybe it's my love for percussive instruments, but the layered marimba and gamelan just suits this ancient temple perfectly. It's so jungle dungeon. And then there's a flute that floats over top of it to add this layer of curiosity. Just feels so meticulous, mysterious. There's an old feeling, like something lost to time, but somehow it's also optimistic in a way. It doesn't have the tango swagger that Eldin did. That track made me want to get out of my seat and just dance. Instead, there's something more immersive about this one. There are so many layers and tones and bells and chimes. I feel enveloped by the instrumentation. There's so much happening in this song without it feeling overwhelming or busy, and even when it takes a moment to remind you of the dangers found within the temple walls, it'll always come back around to that feeling of intrigue. Now, I'm not an expert in music theory. I can only outline for you the feeling that I get from this track. So if you want to hear a more technical breakdown of this song, I'll refer you to this wonderful video by Cadence Hira, hopefully I'm saying that right, which picks the song apart and examines it through a more trained lens. Links are down below in the description, but it is so worth the watch. More than any other dungeon in this game, Faron Temple feels to me as though it fully embraces exploration as an important theme, and this is evident right away. If you follow this mysterious moving plant through the front door, you'll be greeted only by an impassable shut gate. In the first room, the dungeon is telling you, go explore, look around, and figure it out yourself, because you can't just follow the main path through here, and I mean that in the best way. That said, they tease you with the boss key right away here, giving you a pretty solid objective, before putting the gate between you and that big, enticing treasure chest. So what this means is that you have a solid idea of where you need to go, but figuring out how to actually get there is left up to you. I love that. Furthermore, this feels to me like where they've finally hit the mark on a dungeon that is mostly open and non-linear without feeling cheesable. Where Jabul fell short, this dungeon manages to let you run wild and cover a lot of ground, while also adding in a few deliberately placed locked doors and keys to find, which makes that exploration actually meaningful. I think this is the biggest dungeon in the game, spanning 4 floors, containing lots of side-scrolling passageways and a fair-sized exterior area in addition to its own interior footprint. It's a big dungeon. After Eldin especially, which felt too short, this is definitely a step in the right direction. Despite that heavy exploration focus, the dungeon isn't lacking in good individual puzzles, including a number of them that make use of these scales, a mechanic we've seen a number of times in the series, some use of reverse bond to fight through water currents, and perhaps most notably, these puzzles in which 2 switches must be pressed down simultaneously. I've heard of a number of ways to get this done, though I've always defaulted to using Armos and good old timing. But that's the sort of puzzle that this game excels with, where there's some room to play around with it and figure out different ways to do it. And it especially gets good when they start combining these puzzle mechanics, placing Armos on top of those scales or even underwater. There are also these green electric switches, with whatever given room usually containing a handful that need to all be activated within quick succession. As a puzzle mechanic itself, it isn't that groundbreaking. looking, but they do find some neat ways to use it, including putting it in a room full of moving platforms. Neat stuff. And the dungeon gives you several different echoes that you can use in conjunction with these. What surprised me the most upon further examination of Faron is that there are only 3 small keys here, but those keys, and especially those locked doors, are placed so well, so effectively, that it always felt like more to me. The locked doors block access to the dungeon mid-boss, this door towards an optional chest, and then this critical side-scrolling passageway, which will take us towards a rematch with that mid-boss. That second key and locked door is the only real weak spot here for me, especially since the key is found so close by to that locked door, and all you get out of it is a golden egg. But the other 2, brilliant placement, because the dungeon is still otherwise sprawling, open, and interconnected, but progress through the dungeon is gated by exploring and getting those keys, so you can hunt down that mid-boss and ultimately get the boss key. Speaking of that mid-boss, they're first teased to us outside the dungeon, before speeding off into the temple with the boss key in their possession. The first time we'll encounter them for real is behind this very important looking locked door off the central room. It's Manhandla. Yes, that Manhandla from Zelda 1. It's awesome to see them make a main series return. They've only appeared in the original NES Zelda, Oracle of Seasons, the Four Swords games, and Hyrule Warriors if you want to count that. Though I guess you could argue that the Big Baba from Twilight Princess is pretty similar. Aside from perfectly fitting the dungeon's theme, Manhandla feels like just the right choice to pull from this series' history. Iconic, but not overused. They look great here too, distinguished from the Deku Babas sprinkled throughout the dungeon and Faron region beyond, but still leafy and organic. The first fight will limit Manhandla to 2 heads, while the rematch later in the dungeon will use all 4, with the 2 new blue ones being a little stronger. Manhandla's weak points are on their necks, or stems, branches. I'm gonna go with necks. So you can either stun a head and rush into attack, or pull at their heads with bind and have an echo dish out damage. There are probably more strategies that I haven't even thought of, but those 2 both feel satisfying from a gameplay standpoint, honestly. They will try to chomp down on you, and can even swallow your toughest echoes whole, but it's pretty fun to use this to your advantage and feed them bombfish. I really enjoyed this mid-boss. It's not super challenging, but I felt myself just having a great time and feeling enticed to try out different echoes and tools from my kit to see all the ways to deal damage. Defeating them the first time will cause them to flee, while our second victory will reward us with the boss key. So all that's left to do is head towards the boss door, if you haven't found it already, that is. With all of that said, we can now confront the dungeon boss. Bursting from a tangled mass of webs is this game's version of Goma. Here we go. There have been many iterations of Goma over the years. Like Manhandla, Goma was first introduced to us back in the original Legend of Zelda, but unlike Manhandla, she's had lots of main series appearances with designs that have varied, though usually keeping to the theme of being some kind of arthropod or arachnid, but not quite a spider. Twilight Princess's Armagoma leaned the most in the spider direction, with this game coming in a close second. Even the Deku Scrubs refer to her as the Great Spider here. I personally tend to prefer other games' interpretations of Goma as being something a little more unique, Ocarina of Time's being a personal favorite, but I think that's just a general feeling that giant spider with big eyeball feels a bit on the generic side to me. That said, I won't dock them points this time around for 2 reasons. One is that the big eyeball weak point, as overdone as it is, has always been Gohma's thing, ever since the NES days. It's a core part of her identity as a recurring boss. The second reason is that while I may find giant eyeball weak points to be a bit overused in the series as a whole, in the context of this game itself, it just isn't. Gohma is the only boss in Echoes of Wisdom that falls into this trope. So combine those 2 factors, and I find it doesn't actually bother me, especially comparing this to the Gohma of Link's Awakening, a game that shares its art direction, and I can see a sort of continuity between those little guys and this big one. Though maybe I would have liked it a little more if the baby Gohmas that she hatched during the fight, and that you can learn as an Echo before the dungeon itself, resembled that classic design a little more closely. Otherwise, Gohma looks like Gohma. I don't know how else to describe it. As for fighting her, the battle feels pretty nicely telegraphed, and follows a pretty standard sort of combat flow. Gohma has 3 crystals on her body, which need to be activated with electricity. Activating all 3 will stun her, so you can get on top of her body and strike her big eyeball to deal damage. Pretty much what you'd expect. But I'd like to highlight how the game teaches you to use electricity for these crystals just before the dungeon. It's a clever moment where the first time you see one of these is in this cave with these buzz blobs, which are nearly guaranteed to activate this first switch for you. And then you have to activate the other switches in the room on your own in order to unlock the door. Then the dungeon itself keeps building on the mechanic with different room layouts, as I mentioned earlier in the video. This ends up all culminating in the switches being built into Gohma herself, essentially adding a puzzle mechanic from the dungeon into the boss fight, and giving a reliable way to stun her and open her up to attack. It's the closest a boss in this game has felt to having that classic dungeon item integration, without it actually being a dungeon item. Though you can also bypass these crystals entirely with a well-timed shot directly to the eye using your bow. Pretty much exactly like the Ocarina of Time Gohma fight with its slingshot, or even more like the Twilight Princess version when you take her big laser into account. Overall, this is a pretty good fight. Maybe not an incredible one, and one that feels a bit like it's playing it safe, but it does the job and succeeds at being fun and engaging, which is most important. It's always a treat to see Gohma though in some form or another. Ganon aside, she might be the most iconic recurring boss in the entire series. So overall, Faron Temple is solid, and a strong contender for being named my favorite dungeon in this game. It wonderfully embraces that sense of exploration that, in my view, sits at the heart of what makes the best Zelda dungeons as good as they are. Faron Temple balances free open exploration with linear dungeon progression in a really elegant way. Even though there are only a few keys and locked doors here, with only 2 of them being mandatory, they're used sparingly, but really effectively. There are lots of branching paths and open space to explore, both in and out of the temple itself, with very little hand-holding. Try doesn't backseat. They instead ask you, where do we begin? You're given free rein to explore and unravel this dungeon yourself, and I love that. I love getting lost in a dungeon. In fact, as a testament to that navigational emphasis, this is the only dungeon in the game where I've actually found myself using those warp points. They've been present in every dungeon of the game, but I've never bothered with them aside from in this dungeon. Faron is downright labyrinthian too, with a layout that winds and twists back in on itself and seemingly goes on in all directions. Even on repeat playthroughs, I still find myself spending a great deal of time just exploring, checking where every door leads to, though for whatever reason, the map placement always throws me off. I always take a long time to find it, despite seeing that it is placed rather logically near the central room. Maybe it's because my my instincts take me left instead of right when I start exploring, but that's me. I do like how far you can get in any one direction before finding a key or the map though. But that central room with Manhandla's little trail of buds marking the way acts as a great little anchoring point for your exploration. Though while you can wander for a while in any direction, it never ends up feeling aimless to me. Mapping the place out itself and exploring feels so worthwhile, since those paths loop into each other and connect. Even if a room isn't critical, because it's so rarely a dead end, I still feel like I'm making progress. Since the dungeon exterior is a natural extension of the navigation itself, that exploration focus feels even more interesting, adding another plane on top of the existing 4 floors of the interior. Plus, Skullwoods was one of my favorite dungeons in A Link to the Past, and this feels like something of a callback to that, which is always neat. Faron Temple really has it all. Great music, tons of optional goodies and secrets to collect, a moody atmosphere with its use of darkness, fun puzzle mechanics, a wonderful sense of freedom and exploration, deliberate, meticulously placed locked doors, and some really fun combat scenarios. I have a hard time finding any faults here, aside from Goma being a little predictable, but even then, it's a fun enough battle that almost doesn't matter. In the end, Faron Temple succeeds in pretty much every way. In the context of Echoes of Wisdom, or even just the series as a larger whole, this is an awesome dungeon. Conde lives alone. He didn't always. He lived contentedly on Hebra Mountain with his brother and father, but his brother is away traveling, and their father is gone now. Conde alone has become something of a custodian for Hebra. Every day is the same, the mountain buried in snow, but recently something dark has spread on the mountain, something Conde doesn't quite understand. He tries endlessly to clean this gunk, but to no avail. Every day is the same, more snow, cleaning the gunk, and Conde alone in the bitter cold. Snow every day, until one day he sees his brother. He tries to follow along, but the storm picks up. He calls out, but receives no response. His brother has left him alone, vanishing into the storm. He chases until he can stay conscious no more, succumbing to exhaustion. Once again, Conde is alone. Until a small traveler with a strange, even smaller companion arrives on Hebra Mountain, waking Conde. Conde hasn't had company in so long, but these travelers are so small and the storms so vicious, so Conde invites them back to the warmth of his home to wait out the blizzard. She says her name is Zelda, and this little creature is Tri. They're so friendly. Conde feels he must help them. They're mending rifts, whatever those may be, and are trying to reach Holy Mount Lanayru. Conde knows this place. It's where his brother has ventured off to in his hot air balloon. Conde can at least guide them to the top of the mountain where his brother took off. Conde promises his father he will do a good job. Working through the gunk, they all make it to the summit. And then, his brother, Big Brother, is here, but he won't listen to Conde and even knocks him down. Conde needs some time alone. However, it is here atop the mountain summit that Tri can make an opening into the still world. A long journey from Hebra to Mount Lanayru lies ahead of them, one which, after some intense platforming around these stilled, frigid landscapes, will take them to the next dungeon. So, this is where Conde's brother went. Welcome to Lanayru Temple, which I personally prefer to enjoy as the game's final full dungeon. Since the lead-up is a bit more demanding than the other two, it is the most isolated dungeon in the game, technically being outside of the overworld map's boundaries, and thematically the lonely, cold atmosphere just feels right. Upon completing the game for the first time, I immediately labeled Lanayru my favorite dungeon in the game, though now after a couple of additional playthroughs, Faron might be nudging it out. Now that doesn't mean my fondness for this dungeon has diminished in any way, it's just that I've grown to appreciate Faron more with each playthrough. Lanayru is wonderful though, appealing to my tastes with its strong puzzle focus and beautiful atmosphere. This place has vibes up the wazoo. That was a sentence. The architecture is decent here. It's probably the weak point of the dungeon. It's a bit on the simplistic side, with the only real flair showing up around doorways, though there is still a strong visual identity with its cold blues, piles of snow on ledges, and ice everywhere. The walls seem to be either some kind of thick permafrost or blue stone, depending on the room. The architecture itself may not be anything to write home about, but that doesn't mean the dungeon doesn't look great. It's just going for something a little more plain, but still detailed. The textures are littered with signs of wear and tear, scratches and cracks. There's also a slightly industrial element with these large fans and connecting power lines, which are visually distinct and play into the dungeon's puzzle mechanics, which makes the fact that they stand out like that all the more important. So despite the relative minimalism, this dungeon still looks fantastic if you ask me. The cold vibes are captured perfectly. I love the lonely atmosphere. The dungeon music is absolutely gorgeous here too. The first time I played through here, I found myself having to stop in the foyer just to listen and take in this song for a moment. The instrumentation is just perfect for the cold theming. Eldin's theme had that energetic tango swagger. Faron's was layered with curiosity, pushing you to explore. This track, however, feels lonely but simultaneously hopeful. The track echoes and fades in and out, then crescendoing and falling again into bells and choruses that reverberate around. It feels mystical yet calm, optimistic and thoughtful, which fits for a more puzzle-centric dungeon like this. I implore you though, sit with some headphones and just give this one a listen sometime. Oddly, there's a few moments in this music that remind me of the Sanctuary theme from Spirit Tracks. Which, as we'll see, won't be the only element this dungeon seems to pull from the DS Zelda titles. Maybe it's just me hearing something that isn't there, but I swear there's a borrowed phrase in there, just with the instrumentation changed to fit the icy aesthetics of this temple. Progression through Lanayru Temple is substantially less exploratory than Faron. The dungeon has 5 floors, with most of them being relatively short, limited to a few rooms each. The exception is the large basement 3, which houses the bulk of the dungeon, and not coincidentally contains the most interconnected zigzaggy chunk of the layout, which will ultimately complete a loop back in on itself in order to complete the dungeon's final puzzle, whereas almost the entire rest rest of the dungeon is a pretty straight linear shot onwards constantly. As usual, we also have a few side-scrolling rooms. Despite that Eldin felt the most like it was designed around this playstyle, I'm a big fan of how Lanayru implements them here compared to many other dungeons. There are only 4 of these rooms here in total. One of them is a one-off sort of room with a single entry, where you'll go in, complete a puzzle, and go back out the same way you came. The other 3 are reserved as bridging the gaps between floors, essentially just being playable extensions of these ladders, rather than connecting largely disconnected portions of the map horizontally. I know it's a minor difference ultimately, but I just prefer this approach. It makes more sense in my head structurally, allowing me to mentally keep track of the dungeon as a larger whole. Plus, I think this side-scrolling perspective lends itself well to adding more verticality to the gameplay. I don't think I could nail down any one room as being the dungeon's main central chamber this time around, but since this dungeon is far more linear, I don't see this as being an issue. You're not crisscrossing around here like in Faron, but rather you are continuously pushing forward, deeper into the depths of the dungeon as you make progress. That isn't to say that there are no forks in the road at all. The dungeon actually does have plenty of moments where you'll face a locked door, have to take a small detour to solve a puzzle or find a key, and then return to a previous area and unlock a new path. But it isn't anchored to a central focal point that everything branches away from, and that's okay. Having a look at the map, I think the dungeon is of decent size overall, though I do wish it were just a bit longer once again, an issue we'll circle back to in a little bit. But for its size especially, this feels like an incredibly focused, tightly designed dungeon. It has a core concept and strong puzzle mechanics that it executes on wonderfully. So yeah, let's talk about that. The main puzzle mechanic uses a series of orbs that, when placed upon their pedestals, will activate one of the large fans found throughout the dungeon, with the fan being linked to its corresponding pedestal by these power lines. Depending on the state of the orb, which has either a fire or ice state, the fan will either blow heat into the room or cool it down. This can have all sorts of effects depending on the contents of the room these fans are in, most notably melting ice or freezing water, which can be used to open submerged areas up to exploration, or to create a layer of much needed solid ground to stand on or place echoes on top of. It's long-winded to explain this mechanic, but it is exceptionally intuitive in practice. The contrast between hot and cold is something that just about anybody can understand. Regardless, as easy to grasp as this is, the game still does a wonderful job of subtly teaching the player this puzzle mechanic without so much as a word or text box ever popping up on screen, and it does so with a slow rollout of the mechanic that starts out with very basic utility, then gradually iterating on the concept, with added wrinkles and complications as the dungeon goes on. The first puzzle has us bring the orb over to its pedestal, with the fan melting this wall of ice, allowing us to proceed farther into the dungeon. The next instance is in this room, where we can see a key below the ice, so we need to melt the ice in order to retrieve it. There's a cold air geyser placed here as well between the orb's spawn and the pedestal, so it isn't unreasonable that players might accidentally change the state of the orb and learn about being able to use it to cool a room that way as well. While you can make your way up to the locked door without doing so, it will be a lot easier if you revert the room back to its frozen state first, so that friction creates an incentive to try it out. We get another 2 puzzles in which we need to heat up the rooms in order to melt ice that's blocking the way, then the inverse, in which this switch puzzle will be leagues easier if we freeze the room over. Again, technically doable without freezing the water, but so much easier if you do. finally, this all culminates in a big puzzle. There's a snowball that we must roll down this ramp in order to activate this big yellow switch. First, however, we must transport this orb in the western room to heat up this adjacent room so that the pedestal can even be reached. Then use the orb in this room, changing its state with the torch in here, to melt the icicles that block the snowball's way, then refreeze the water so that it can roll smoothly over to the big button. It's a great puzzle idea, with this mechanic being used in ways that continuously add layers of complexity, not just in the way the different states of the room must be used, but also in the obstacles it keeps placing in your path. The first orb we transport in a pretty safe room. The second one has a geyser. Pretty soon we get entire obstacle courses separating the orbs from their destinations, making simply transporting the orb a challenge in and of itself, as you avoid obstacles that will cause you to either drop the orb or accidentally change its state to the one opposite of what you actually want. And then finally having to complete an entire one of these orb puzzles to access the two main components of the bigger puzzle. There's such a wonderfully tuned sense of iteration and escalation here. I love this stuff. I just have one complaint. I want more. The sheer complexity this mechanic could allow for is fantastic. The issue is that when it starts to feel like they're really applying the pressure, really building something complex and thoughtful, the dungeon gives you the boss key and comes to an end. It's really just too bad that it isn't explored to its fullest. I think just one more large-scale puzzle would do the trick. I think back to how the Earth Temple in Wind Waker kept building upon its puzzle ideas with these mirrors, starting simple, arming your companion with a light reflecting object, then giving you the mirror shield, all building towards this one final awesome multi-mirror light reflecting puzzle that uses both characters to interact with it after moving several mirrors into place. The scale of it is awesome. That's what I want. A multi-step, large-scale puzzle that puts this hot-cold mechanic to use in clever ways, having us change the state of the room multiple times to move objects, push switches, all of that stuff. Don't get me wrong, I adore what's here. They crafted something truly special with this dungeon. It's just that it has left me hungry for more. Of course, there are more puzzles than just this core mechanic, such as the classic torch lighting style puzzle in this side-scrolling room. I really enjoyed this one, and several instances in which we need to use echoes to create bridges or stairs for ourselves, though the puzzle platforming aspect of things can be somewhat undermined in the same fashion that Jabul suffered from with regards to the water block. We'll be able to learn the cloud echo during the still world section leading up to the dungeon, and it is extremely versatile. It is literally a stationary floating platform that you can spawn, creating stairs through the air on the fly without solid ground as a foundation. This is especially overpowered during side-scrolling sections in which you can spawn it directly below yourself in midair. Who needs an infinite jump glitch when you've got cloud echoes? Credit where credit is due though. Within Lanayru Temple itself, they were pretty good about placing hazards such as these geysers, which will prevent total cheesability with clouds. Mostly. Regardless, I really appreciate having these additional little puzzles and obstacles. Sometimes these will be isolated, and sometimes integrated into other larger puzzles. This might be the dungeon in which I find myself using the bind ability the most, since the orbs require them to be transported, and you can use bind with objects in order to shield yourself from the hazards that are sprinkled throughout the temple. So far, while I've mostly talked about the puzzle aspect of the dungeon, there is still some combat worth mentioning. Mostly, the enemies in here act like obstacles to work past while transporting orbs, but a few times they'll have combat scenarios where they'll lock you in a room and have you fight it out. Among the most notable of these are the White Wolfos, granting you a formidable echo to add to your arsenal. Appearing here in this ice dungeon feels like something of a callback to the White Wolfos being the sort of boss of Ocarina of Time's Ice Cavern as well. Then there's the dungeon's mid-boss, which is apparently Slime Eye, making a return from Link's Awakening. Didn't recognize you there. I think I actually prefer this version of Slime Eye to its Koholint counterpart. You need to freeze and shatter it apart, and it will keep breaking into smaller, slimy voids as you do. All the while, it will try to remain warm using the hot spring in this room, and use said spring water to launch a scalding attack at you. It's a neat concept for a mid-boss, and reasonably challenging, I would say. It also happens to play into the hot-cold motif that is ever present throughout the dungeon too, and I think that covers most of it. So, once we've completed this excellent puzzle and gotten the boss key from that treasure chest that was just teasing you before, we can head down to the very bottom floor and confront the dungeon boss. With nowhere left to run to, we can confront the creature that we previously thought to be Kande's brother. This is Scorchel, like scorch, chill, like hot, cold, scorch, chill. Anyways, Scorchel is thankfully an original boss. Mostly, I mean. We have technically never seen Scorchel himself before, but he is still clearly inspired by some pretty familiar elements. Most notably, the elements. Scorchel is what I call a dual element type boss, which the Zelda series has had many of in the past. The likes of Trinix, Twinrova, Phantom Hourglass's Gleeok, and probably more that I haven't even thought of. Though he may have the most in common with Fraz from Spirit Tracks, since he chooses to alternate between his fire and ice elemental states, rather than juggling both at once like the others I mentioned. Though of course he doesn't split apart into little guys like Fraz did, but hey, Slime Eye already covered that concept earlier, I guess. Visually, his design, when he isn't looking like the Metal Mario at home, also reminds me of the Yuke from Phantom Hourglass, whereas Kande could be seen as something of a visual reference to the Anuki tribe, which were feuding with the Yuke in that game. It's probably nothing more than a visual reference, though as a side note, Kande may have more in common with the Yetis from Twilight Princess, but we're getting off track. Scorchel's dual elemental style boss fight is done well here, and gives a good reason to actually employ echoes during the battle, by attacking him using the opposite element to what he is using, before yanking his helmet off with Bind and then dealing damage. Zelda has no way to use fire or ice attacks herself, so deploying echoes is more vital here than pretty well any other boss fight in the game. There's a pretty good combat flow to be had here too. Scorchel doesn't just take it lying down either. He retaliates with a variety of fire and ice attacks in multiple phases, initially just sticking to one element per combat cycle during the first phase, and then swapping between fire and ice on the fly during the second phase. His attacks vary from charging at you, spitting projectiles, and even these huge flame tornadoes, and even the room changes to adapt to which element he is using, which will cause those ever-contentious ice physics to show up if he's using cold attacks. So like with Slime Eye, it feels like this boss fight itself is playing into the dungeon's hot and cold mechanics. What a well-implemented thematic throughline. You've got to keep moving to stay safe, and keep your own echoes on him. I personally am partial to swapping between fire and ice wizrobes, but even elemental Keese will do the trick, which is good too because of the game's flexible dungeon order. You may not have gone up Eldin by this point, or encountered a fire wizrobe yet, but there is a single fire Keese that can be found within Lanayru Temple, which feels like a nice contingency, so that no matter the dungeon order you do, you'll still have the means to be able to defeat the boss. This fight is so much fun. It's fast, frenetic, and feels like a perfect fit for this dungeon, carrying on that aforementioned thematic throughline that has been ever present in so many of the temple's puzzles right into the battle mechanics. It's not the first time we've had a dual elemental type boss like this, and it probably won't be the last. But I don't think I ever get tired of the concept. There's something just intuitive about it. Plus, when looking at the original bosses that they came up with for this game, rather than the returning bosses from previous Zelda titles, this may just be the best one yet. It might be my favorite boss in the game. So overall, just like Faron, Lanayru is a strong contender for being my favorite dungeon in the game. I'm still a little unsure of which dungeon gets to take that crown, but Lanayru makes a strong case, and it makes it well. This has surprised some people. After all, this is an ice dungeon, and I don't usually like slippery ice physics all that much. However, the ice spikes that you can find during the dungeon lead-up entirely negates this loss in traction, and rewards players with a great item if they explored the mountain thoroughly. So honestly, I forgot all about it. So my advice is, get the ice spikes before this dungeon. Also, like Faron, I was surprised by the overall small key count. There are only 2 this time around, way fewer than it feels like, but they're used pretty flawlessly. Any more would be superfluous, since the dungeon tends to gate your progression with puzzles instead of keys. These big ice walls that need melting being the most common obstacle. Though I do think the cloud echo might make it a little too easy to cheese some of these sections, there's at least enough friction here that you have to be somewhat thoughtful about how you place them, rather than just spamming clouds until your problems are solved. Something that makes Lanayru even better is the way it actually fits into a larger whole with the other 2 dungeons that you can access at this point in the game. The 3 temples are named after the 3 golden goddesses, and for good reason. For the first time in the series, you actually get to interact directly with these 3 goddesses before receiving their sanctions. The 3 goddesses also have a close association with the 3 virtues of the Triforce: power, wisdom, and courage. These virtues are likewise reflected in the overall design principles of these dungeons. In Eldin, we have power. The temple is in a deadly volcanic landscape, and is the most action-heavy with its platforming focus. Faron represents courage with its heavy emphasis on raw exploration, especially having you push forward and explore in the pitch black dark. Lanayru, as I've talked about a lot already, is the game's most puzzle-focused dungeon, and of course, represents the virtue of wisdom. So not only do these 3 dungeons have their own environmental themes, but they collectively fit into one bigger picture, tempering Zelda to be worthy of the sanctions that she receives from these goddesses at the end of their respective dungeons. Above all else though, Lanayru just feels so tightly designed. We have a wide enemy variety, all of which perfectly fit the dungeon's theme, plenty of optional goodies to collect, including some fun hidden treasure in alcoves, and some of the game's most wonderful puzzles. I love some of the clever environmental context clues, like the hidden ladder below the ice blocks in this room. I probably would have found it anyways because I have fun using braziers to melt everything, but I could see someone having to stop in this room, halted by that locked door, and that torch being what tips them off. Alternatively, the dungeon at times teases you by letting you see things that you can't do yet, such as the layout having you walk through the room with this big boss key puzzle long before you're able to actually solve it. The dungeon's biggest and perhaps only shortcoming is the overall length. I wish it were longer. What is here is so good. I just want more of it. Just one or two more iterations of that puzzle, and I think the dungeon would be perfect actually, though I suppose it is pretty telling of the overall quality that me just wanting more of it is my biggest critique of the place. Lanayru Temple is one of the best dungeons we've seen in recent years. From the atmosphere to the music to that lovely puzzle design, this is a great dungeon through and through. So in addition to the main story dungeons, Echoes of Wisdom also has a handful of optional mini dungeons spread out throughout the world of Hyrule. These are great little side adventures that offer some genuinely worthwhile rewards, such as unique gear and heart pieces. So before we get to the end of the game, I wanted to highlight these real quick, since I genuinely think these are fun little inclusions in an already densely packed game. So let's hop into it. The first of these mini dungeons that you are likely to encounter, based on its location and the lower amount of prerequisites, is the Eastern Temple, which can be completed pretty much any time after Suthorn Ruins. There's an archaeologist outside the temple entrance named Sago, who has been hearing voices from inside the structure, and it's up to us to investigate. I'm particularly fond of this one's inclusion since the Eastern Temple is actually the same building that we have previously known as the Eastern Palace. The very same Eastern Palace that was the first full-length dungeon of A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds. This version of the iconic structure is of course substantially scaled down here, but it's a little bonus treat, not a full-length dungeon. So that's okay. The temple has its own unique architecture and color palette, and I think it really looks great with the purple tiles and green walls. It evokes the original without being exactly the same thing that we've already seen a couple of times already. The main puzzle mechanic here has us using bind to move objects and these spark enemies around in order to feed the sparks into these yellow boxes, which will open the way forward. These start out pretty straightforward, but do become a little more complicated as they iterate on the idea, including having bars separate you from the puzzle itself, meaning you've got to spawn your echoes on the other side and move them into position with bind. It's pretty cool. Not only is this a fun puzzle mechanic on its own, but it also serves as a sort of tutorial for the boss fight. This is Smog, who is actually a returning boss, previously only seen in Oracle of Ages. Smog will break into smaller smoggy boys, which you need to make collide into each other, as he'll only be vulnerable in his complete form, basically the opposite of Slime Eye, who needed to be broken apart. When we fought Smog in Oracle of Ages, we had to use the Cane of Sumaria to place blocks in his path to achieve this, which was a perfect dungeon item use case, honestly. Spawning echoes is, in some ways, the Cane of Sumaria taken to its most logical extreme, so Smog really is a perfect fit for this game, though there are enough objects in this room already that we can use bind with to move into position and achieve this. Still, what a seamless way to incorporate a throwback boss. Smog's behavior didn't need to be altered in any way to make this fight work, because we have the tools we need already at our disposal. A perfect adaptation. Anyways, I find this fight a lot of fun. It's just as much a puzzle as it is a battle, which is already something I like when Zelda games do, but it's very fitting for a game with wisdom in the title, you know? The next mini dungeon is the Wrecked Ship. This guy in Seaside Village will give you the quest to evict the electric monster that has taken residency in his boat. This one might be my favorite of the game's mini dungeons, to be honest. In every playthrough, I'm always surprised by how expansive it really is, though still not full dungeon length, of course. As the name implies, it's a vessel in disrepair, and it looks and feels the part, with broken wooden beams and water water flooding large portions of the ship. This one doesn't have as strong of a core dungeon mechanic as the Eastern Temple, but it's still pretty fun to comb through. Though I'm not really sure about the inclusion of this side-scrolling cave section. I guess we're meant to be briefly leaving the ship to explore an attached underwater cave and then re-entering the boat elsewhere, but I guess it just feels a little out of place. A lot of the puzzles here involve either clearing away crates or using the objects around to create a path forward, though that idea gets a little undermined by having echoes of your own to use for those purposes. Still, there's a nice mind puzzle here that feels like a direct follow-up from the ones introduced in Suthorn. The wrecked ship instead has more of an action focus, with tons of enemies in nearly every room. So between the combat and the vibes, I just find this place to be a really enjoyable little excursion. The boss here is also superbly fun. I actually thought that this was a redesigned Baronade. You know, the boss from Jabu Jabu's Belly in Ocarina of Time. The behavior is basically identical. It surrounds itself with Biri and spins around to attack. So I just assumed that they altered the appearance of Baronade to fit this change in setting, and align the boss itself with the Biri that it employs. But according to both Zelda Dungeon and Zelda Wiki, both sources I trust, this is actually a new boss called Bori. But Bori here is basically Baronade 2.0, minus the spikes. That said, I really enjoy this boss, despite it being a bit on the easy side, especially if you come equipped with a smoothie that gives you the lightning proof effect. Lots of fun, nonetheless. In the Faron wetlands, a little Deku scrub will send us into the hidden ruins to pursue rumors of cotton candy. The hidden ruins are something of a follow-up to the Eastern Temple, though using the same aesthetics and architectural style that we saw in Faron Temple, though I can't complain because I think it looks great. The puzzles here use the same core concept that we saw in Eastern Temple though, guiding sparks into these yellow switch boxes, though these ones are a bit more complicated, including more enemies and having a few of these puzzles in these side-scrolling rooms. Although Eastern Temple had rooms in this perspective, they didn't contain any of these yellow box puzzles, so now we get to try some from that perspective and underwater to boot. This ends in a rematch against Smog, which likewise occurs in a side-scrolling room rather than top-down like last time. The fight goes pretty well the same as before, aside from using the room layout's verticality. It's a good fight, but more of the same, so I won't really dwell on it. Though I appreciate the humor of that Deku scrub mistaking Smog for cotton candy, and then outright refusing to believe you when you tell him the truth. Classic Deku. The Summit Cave is the last of the mini-dungeons, and it might be the least memorable of the bunch if you ask me. We hear that Darstan went up to a cave near the top of Eldin Volcano, but hasn't been seen in a while. We'll find him investigating rumors of a fire giant, so we just go on ahead to check it out. This isn't a bad mini-dungeon, but I feel like it lacks the unique flavor and settings that the others have, to the point where despite being 3 entire 100% playthroughs deep into this game, I keep forgetting this place even exists. The cave aesthetic is stuff we've already seen, and a lot of the puzzles are kinda just rehashed stuff we've seen in Eldin Temple. You know, rock climbing, using lava rocks for platforms on rising magma, and avoiding getting set on fire. Normal stuff. Man, what varnish do they use on these ladders though? Like I said, it isn't a bad mini-dungeon, but it kind of blends into the other caves around Eldin, whereas the other dungeons at least stood out either with unique theming or puzzle mechanics. The lack of all that makes this one feel just a little unimpressive by comparison. It doesn't help that this is the only mini-dungeon that doesn't have a unique boss battle. The boss here is the Volcanic Talus. It is pretty much exactly the same as the Seismic Talus that we fought back in Suthorn, except, you know, hotter. though I don't want to sell this fight short. Despite being iterative, the added fire and more aggressive attack cycle does make this a substantially more challenging boss than its southern counterpart. He doesn't linger at the end of his attack animations for nearly as long, making it way more difficult to get a lock on his weak point and use bind. He just attacks relentlessly. I kind of love it. This guy is definitely harder than the other mini dungeon bosses, and may even be tougher than any of the main story dungeon bosses, aside from perhaps the game's final boss. And that's really cool. I like it. I just also find it weirdly forgettable, and that probably comes down to the fact that it's basically a rehash along with everything else in this mini dungeon. So that covers it, I think. Those are the mini dungeons, which I think are overall quite good, especially for optional side content. Their inclusion makes the world feel a little more fleshed out and robust, and the rewards are generally pretty good. Not all of the gear is super useful. The Deku Charm is particularly good though, but even still I enjoy collecting unique goodies like this. And hey, they all have heart pieces, so that would make them worthwhile to me already. The unique gear is just a great little bonus. These are obviously not as in-depth as the main story dungeons, but they're not supposed to be either. I think they serve a particular purpose, and for the most part, I think they pull it off excellently. Before we wrap things up with Echoes of Wisdom, there's one final section of the game I'd like to discuss, one that, while brief, fills the role of the game's final dungeon. So, this is your spoiler warning. From here on, we're talking about the end of the game. But first, a bit of context. During Zelda's quest to close the rifts and receive sanctions from the 3 golden goddesses, we learn a few vital bits of information. Information that reframes how we can view the entire series. In the beginning, Null existed in the void, devouring all things that would attempt to take shape. The goddesses created the world to contain Null. Hyrule is a prison. The rifts we have been closing are Null's attempts to return the world to the void. Null is the name of our enemy, and we've seen them before. Remember that creature that captured Link after our battle with Ganon at Hyrule Castle? That was Null. But Null isn't a mindless beast. They've been waiting to enact their plans. With the 3 sanctions bestowed upon Zelda by the goddesses, Null creates an echo of Zelda herself in order to lay claim to the prime energy that we heard legend of. After completing a puzzle in the Eternal Forest and a quick exchange with the Great Deku Tree, we can pursue this echo. The prime energy is in fact the Triforce. However, Null's heart is not in balance, and as we know, this means that they are unable to lay claim to this awesome relic. Instead, it splits, with Null receiving the Triforce of Power, Zelda receiving Wisdom, and Courage being sent into the Still World to seek out and reside within Link. Null seeks to reunite the 3 pieces of the Triforce, and it's up to Zelda to pursue her echo. So for the final time, we venture into the Still World, but this time to put an end to things once and for all. After the longest Still World platforming section yet, one which combines elements from all previous dungeons, we'll have to battle our own echo and rescue Link. This is a great little pre-dungeon boss fight. Loads of fun. Working together, the hero of legend and priestess of wisdom must enter Null itself in order to stop this entity's cycle of destruction. And this brings us to the game's final dungeon, Null's body. We're in the end game now. There's no turning back. Inside Null's body is the short but climactic finale for Echoes of Wisdom. The dungeon itself feels organic and otherworldly, Fitting for the inside of this eldritch, primordial being, Null has been devouring bits of the world for ages, and pieces of buildings and trees that are being slowly digested can be seen all over the place. Not only that, but the faces of the countless tries that Null has consumed are too visible in the walls and floors. Barriers and fences look like bone, horns, or whatever the equivalent to blood vessels would be in such an ancient being. Maybe even strands of Null's DNA. The music in here takes elements from the usual still world theme and infuses them with what I could only describe as a haunting lullaby. It's eerie, off-kilter, and absolutely perfect. There's just something so creepy about the whole place, like something just isn't quite right. The main draw of the dungeon has us working together with Link to solve puzzles, defeat enemies, and move forward. Mostly the latter. Initially, you'll be fighting together, but then they start separating you into different rooms, forcing you to lean on your echoes to fight for you. Since you've returned Link's weapons to him before entering Null, you can't make use of sword fighter form anymore, so you've got to get creative with what you've got. Or spam Lionels. The puzzles in here are decent. A couple of platforming challenges, activating switches, the usual stuff. The best of the bunch shows up in this room, in which Link is on one side of the room, and you need to use either echoes or bind to help him reach the switch and open the way forward. It's a neat little puzzle. The downside is that that's about all there is to this place. I hate sounding like a broken record, but I'm going to say it again anyways. I like the concepts that they've introduced, and there's a lot of great gameplay potential to be had here. I really enjoy working together as a team with Link. I just want more of it. For this being the end game, I never really feel like I'm being pushed to my limits. We only really get a couple of puzzles, combat scenarios, and hallways before we're staring down the drop into the boss arena. Essentially, the dungeon is just too short. And that's my only complaint really. It's okay that it's so linear, since it's this climactic build-up to the final boss, but there's barely any of it. I mean, look at the map of this dungeon compared to even Suthorn Ruins, the game's first dungeon. As I said though, I do really like what we did get, even if there wasn't enough of it. The vibe in here is just the right amount of creepy. You really feel like you're venturing somewhere that nobody was ever meant to see. It's a little gross, but it works. So, after not too long, we'll reach this final drop, one that feels like a direct callback to the Windfish's egg. Dropping down, we'll be taken directly to the game's final boss. It's time to confront Null. This battle is incredible. It might be one of the best final bosses in the series. Null looks great. Like this being is trying to take on the form of the many tries that it has been devouring without fully understanding them. Just like we've seen dark echoes of Link and Zelda, this could be seen as Try's evil counterpart. It looks fleshy, the arms having exposed tendons and a hard shell that gradually breaks apart over the course of the battle. Null feels like something completely out of this world. We've had more than our fair share of familiarity in this game, which I've liked, but I find the callbacks and reused bosses easier to enjoy when they're balanced with fresh and interesting ideas, which is on full display with Null here. Null will summon many creatures to fight for it, including previous bosses that we faced, and constantly will try to lash out with its claws, or even grab and restrain you. The fight emphasizes teamwork though. When you target and use bind on one of Null's many arms, for example, Link and your own echoes that you summon will prioritize attacking that target, allowing you to direct the flow of the battle. And Link is an absolute unit in this game. They did not nerf my boy. I've seen a lot of folks expressing their distaste for not being so directly involved in the battle, but I just don't see it. You have to constantly stay moving to avoid the barrage of attacks. You can dictate both what Link and your echoes target, or use Bind to pull Null's limbs into Link's sword range. And there are side-scrolling portions of the battle where you and Link get entirely separated. The battle is hectic. There's such a frenetic quality to it, and I love it. Zelda herself has been an active participant in the final battle a few times before, and I've always enjoyed that more than when she's just a passive observer on the sidelines. This feels like the ultimate evolution of that concept. Link is here with you, but as Zelda's support this time, as we take the reins and control the flow of battle. Then there's the music, this wonderful, beautiful music. It starts with this tense version of Null's theme, which works for that first phase. But when we move into the final phase of the battle, and as Null grows weaker and we have the upper hand, an emotional piece takes over, drowning out Null's theme. It has elements from the main series theme, from the game's main theme, and Zelda's lullaby all mixed in together. It is wonderful, and such a perfect, climactic way to cap off this fight. Finally, after enough limbs are severed and Null's shell broken apart, we'll see it, that sacred golden triangle that Null stole. For one last time, with Link's help, we can use Bind to pull it. Wisdom and courage united to overpower this ancient evil, extracting that final piece of the Triforce and bringing Null itself to an end. Emotional goodbyes and pleasant hellos are exchanged, and the threat has ceased to be. I love this finale. There's no Deus Ex Machina, there's no contrivances. Everything from the power of the Triforce being able to mend the land, to everyone being shocked that Link can speak again, to Tri saying that they feel thank you. All of it stems from things the game has taken the time to establish and build up to. This may not be a perfect game, but this might be a perfect ending. Before wrapping things up, I do want to make a note and address something. Over the course of this series, I've been told that I've been far too charitable towards this game and its dungeon design, too generous with my praise, but I really do mean what I say. I hold the Zelda series in the highest regard, but I have always tried to approach my critiques of it in a fair and honest way. Despite loving Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I did not shy away from being critical of some of its design choices, because I know what that development team is capable of. With Echoes of Wisdom, however, this is Grezzo's first attempt at an original Zelda title. This dev team previously has only worked on remakes, notably Ocarina of Time 3D, Majora's Mask 3D, and Link's Awakening. But it's clear to me that they care a great deal about this series. Making a good Zelda game is no easy task, but I'm willing to give Grezzo the benefit of the doubt here. This is a small studio working on one of the biggest gaming franchises of all time, and I think they have a serious handle on what makes this series so special. So I want to say thank you, Grezzo, for this wonderful, charming little entry in my favorite series. So, this is a wrap on the dungeon design of Echoes of Wisdom. As my plans stand right now, unless Nintendo decides to throw another surprise Zelda title our way, we'll be taking yet another look at some non-in-house developed Zelda games. So join us soon when we look at the dungeon design of the Oracle games, which I've been really looking forward to digging into. But for now, I'd like to say thank you so much for watching. I'd like to extend a special thanks to Pixel Fusion Productions for his help gathering the absolutely beautiful FreeCam footage that I've used through this series, the Dream Shrine for providing me with rips of the dungeon maps, and of course, my lovely patrons and YouTube members who support this channel. You all are awesome. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.